Chapter 358. P.S. I thought I would be able to rest for a few days in September, but this bear is being unreasonable. When the Kuan Dao departure realm was established, the people's hearts were not stable. There were many indigenous forces in this area and they colluded with each other. In order to avoid intensifying conflicts, and also because he did not have the ability to plow through the courts like Xianyuan, the Kuan Dao departure realm set its location at the edge of the territory. It was on a large deserted island that no one wanted, which was the current Fangting Island. Because of the continuous eruption of the geocentric spirit veins of the Five Rings, this huge region was injected with endless vitality. Many originally deserted places had undergone subversive changes, including Fangting Island. After more than 10,000 years of change, this place seemed to have completely changed. From the original deserted place, it was now a paradise on earth, a place that everyone envied. But there was one thing that could not be changed, and that was the geographical location of Fangting Island. It was still at the edge of the entire Kuan Dao territory, bordering with other orthodoxies. This was rare in the cultivation world, which usually placed the mountain gate in the center of the territory, and it was also the reason why it could easily cause trouble. For example, this time, it was an unreasonable request from an indigenous tribe to return Fangting Island to the Kuan Dao departure realm. They were not asking for the Kuan Dao cultivators to leave, but for hundreds of thousands of tribes to move in. Of course, there were several orthodoxies behind this. Otherwise, how could a mere mortal tribe ask for the mountain gate of a major cultivation sect to open for them? The matter from more than 10,000 years ago was only brought up now by some forces that did not like the Kuan Dao. The reason was very complicated, and there was no need to clarify it one by one. In the end, it still depended on strength. This was an eternal truth in the cultivation world. This kind of trouble had never stopped in the history of the Kuan Dao departure realm. Most of the time, the Kuan Dao cultivators used their own wisdom to solve the problem, but there were also times when they needed allies. This was the reason why Wei Jianshan appeared. The habit of the Dharma lineage was to be listless. There was no end to it. They did not pursue success with a single strike. Instead, they relied on their own strength to continuously knock out the enemy. Of course, it would be best if they succeeded, but it did not matter if they did not succeed. They would just leave it for the next time. This time, it was a heavier blow. This matter concerned the foundation of Boating Island and could not be lost. If the mortal tribes could live on Boating Island, then the cultivators of other orthodoxies would follow closely behind. Once the mountain gate became open to the public, how could they control it? The Fifth Ring lacked everything. It lacked resources and talents, but it didn't lack a place for humans to live in. They didn't want to go anywhere but Fangting Island. Their true purpose was obvious. For example, the Three Pure Ones had recently created a gimmick about the return of ancient tribes in Irai. Cultivators and mortals were of one mind, and their sharpness could cut through metal. The tribes would merge and return to their ancient hometowns. This was the background of the entire incident. After years of hype, they slowly started to make their move on the various sects in Irai. Of course, those who were on good terms with the Three Pure Ones did not need to consider this problem. Those who were not on good terms with the Three Pure Ones were the ones who suffered. Of course, Wei Jianshan had to help the Kuan Dao departure realm, because helping the Kuan Dao meant helping themselves. If they did not do anything, after a sect like the Kuan Dao gave in, the next step would be the slightly weaker top forces like Wei Jianshan. The Kuan Dao departure realm rejected this proposal very firmly, leaving no room for negotiation. The mountain gate was the bottom line of a life-and-death battle. There was no room for negotiation. In fact, any force that was forced by the Three Pure Ones would make the same choice, regardless of strength. This was the limit of their strength. If it was Xianyuan, he would directly fight back with his flying sword. The Three Pure Ones should move out of the Fifth Ring first. Of course, the Three Pure Ones would not make such a request to Xianyuan. The rejection was, of course, within the Three Pure Ones' expectations. They were not naive enough to think that such a strategy could make people bow down to them. Their ultimate goal was not for the Kuan Dao departure realm to really give up Fanting Island and ignite a war between cultivators. Instead, they wanted to use this opportunity to warn, rope in, divide, weaken, and suppress. For example, now, they took advantage of the situation and proposed a solution. The purpose of the solution was not to solve the problem of ownership of Fanting Island. This was the core problem. There was no room for negotiation. They could only use their lives to negotiate. What they were discussing was whether to allow the mortal race to fish in the coastal waters of Fanting Island. This was the way the Dharma sects considered problems. They would always first put forward a condition that you could not accept, then take advantage of the situation to give in. Finally, they would reveal their true intention, to nibble away, asking for a sky-high price and paying the price when the price fell. In fact, the way they considered problems was no different from how mortals considered problems. As for whether to allow the mortal race to come over, the Kuan Dao departure realm still refused to give in. In the end, they used the method of the cultivation world to determine the winner and loser. This was an invitation from the Soul Foundation establishment cultivator of the mortal race. As a sect, it was impossible for them to directly refuse under such circumstances. 9 rounds to determine the winner and loser. This indigenous cultivator invited his friends to come over and help him fight against the cultivators of the Kuan Dao departure realm to determine whether this race was allowed to have the right to fish around Fanting Island in the future. This was a general strategy that had been decided long ago, but the two sides had wrangled over how to choose the manpower for several years. As for the mortal race, there was no need to think to know who the helpers were. The indigenous cultivator himself was one of the best in the Foundation establishment group of the 3 Pure Ones. This time, for the benefit of his race, it seemed normal to ask his sect for help. Although it was said to be a competition with the mortal race, it was actually a competition with the 3 Pure Ones. In the 5-ring continent, there was no one stronger than the 3 Pure Ones in the Dharma sections. There was only one supreme, but it was only on par with the 3 Pure Ones. Under such circumstances, the result of the Kuan Dao departure realm could be imagined. To be honest, if the Kuan Dao departure realm could win one of the 9 rounds, it would be a victory worth celebrating. Therefore, they had to ask for external help. In the Arai region, there were not many who dared to directly challenge the 3 Pure Ones, and there were even fewer who had the strength to fight. In the end, the Kuan Dao departure realm could only rely on the Weijian mountain. A few other sects had indeed proposed to help, but their own strength was limited. They had the will but not the strength. Everyone knew that swordsmen restrained Dharma cultivators, especially a top swordsman sect like the Weijian mountain. Therefore, they continued to wrangle over how many swordsmen could be arranged for the Kuan Dao departure realm. If they were all swordsmen of the Weijian mountain, then this round would basically become a competition between the 3 Pure Ones and the Weijian mountain. Therefore, the allocation of the quota was a big problem. The Kuan Dao wanted 5, but the indigenous people insisted that they could not have more than 4. The mystery was intriguing. In the end, after a long tug-of-war, the 3 Pure Ones saw that the Kuan Dao would rather fight to the death than retreat, so they could only agree that the Kuan Dao could have up to 5 foreign aid. This seemed to be a concession by the 3 Pure Ones, and it was possible that the Kuan Dao departure realm would lose 4 to 5 in the end, but was that really the case? This was still a strategic problem for the 3 Pure Ones. The core of their strategy was to make concessions on key issues and gain the initiative in other aspects of the negotiation. In the words of a Jing Dan of the 3 Pure Ones, Weijian Mountain was not Xianyuan. Even if you had 9 swordsmen, you would still not be a match for the 3 Pure Ones. This was the confidence of the top Dharma sects. Chapter 359. Author's note: I'm at my limit again. Does anyone have the monthly votes to feed me? I can still catch my breath. In the overall power structure of the swordsmen, the Dharma veins actually had their own analysis. They divided the swordsmen of the Sword Alliance into 4 levels. The first level, Xuanyuan's inner sword. This was the backbone of the sword vein, and no one dared to underestimate it. This was not a fantasy. but a glorious history that had existed for tens of thousands of years. This group had never disappointed anyone in every situation that required them, not to mention the existence of this group that once dominated the entire universe. The second level, Firmament's inner sword. They were also inner sword orthodoxies, but whether it was history or present, whether it was quality or quantity, there was always an inexplicable gap between them and the Xianyuan. Was it temperament? Was it confidence? Or was it glory that had existed for tens of thousands of years? The third level, Weijian Mountain's outer sword, was actually not that different from the Firmament's inner sword. They were also outer swords that truly possessed the temperament of the swordsman. This was because they were able to go against Supreme before they moved to the fifth ring, and went against the three pure ones after they moved to the fifth ring. They were still living well after tens of thousands of years. The fourth level, Xuanyuan's outer sword. This was a branch that lived under the wings of the Xuanyuan's inner sword. It was the largest, but also the most mediocre. Perhaps they would grow if they were sent out alone? No one could say for sure. They had the largest foundation, the most complete system, and the safest environment, but they could not produce the best talents. They were born in hardship and die in peace. For Dharma veins giants like the three pure ones and Supreme, they were not afraid of anyone other than the Xuanyuan's inner sword. This was not arrogance, but strength. In the elite level, their battle record against the swordsman was not weak at all, even slightly stronger than the Xuanyuan's inner sword. This was why they were not afraid of a few outer swords. In fact, they had already gained a huge advantage in this bet, and that was to determine the winner in 9 matches. The biggest difference between the Dharma vein and the sword vein was the difference in numbers. If the winner was decided in a single match, with the strongest swordsman going up against the strongest spellcaster, the sword vein would have an 80% chance of winning, and the remaining 20% would at least be able to perish together. The sword range still had a higher chance of winning in 3 rounds. It was hard to say if it would be decided after 9 rounds. 100 battles to determine victory and defeat, the sword range was bound to lose. This was the foundation of the law lineage. That was why they had persisted for 9 rounds, and not 7 or 5. The more people there were, the greater the advantage of the law lineage. This was because they had a deeper foundation of talents. However, the 3 pure ones wanted to expand their advantage even further. Therefore, they proposed the condition that the participating cultivators must not be experts on the ranking board. Regarding this problem, the Kuan Dao and Li Jia were in a dilemma. They were not troubled by themselves. None of the Kuan Dao cultivators were on the ranking board. Firstly, they were not strong, and secondly, they were not in the mood to fight. However, they were worried about the Wei Sword Mountain. Of course, the Wei Sword Mountain had experts on the ranking board, and there were quite a few of them in the top 100. This sounded like a restriction on the strength of the Wei Sword Mountain, but in reality, this condition was even more restrictive on the 3 pure ones. This was because the number of cultivators from the 3 pure ones on the 5 rings foundation building ranking was the highest among all the sects in the 5 rings. The meaning of the 3 pure ones was very clear. They were not competing on the ranking board, but on the foundation of the sect. They were competing on whose sect had more hidden talents. This was partly due to the generosity of the 3 pure ones, but it was also due to their selfishness. After all, they were all in the top 100 of the ranking board. If they really pulled all of them together, it would be hard to say who would win or lose. This was because not everyone on the ranking board had fought against each other before. They were still slightly wary of the swordsman, even if he was an external sword. The Kuan Dao and Li Jia threw this problem to the Wei Sword Mountain for them to decide. In the end, due to various reasons, the Wei Sword Mountain agreed to the 3 pure ones' request. All the participating cultivators could not be on the current ranking board. However, they also raised another request. The arena would be changed to a defending arena system, and not a single battle. The final number of battles would be decided. The reason for this was because there were individual swordsmen who had the ability to continuously fight. It was not because their mana was deep and could last for a few rounds. No matter how deep their mana was, it would not be as deep as a spell cultivator. The three Pure Ones' idea was to place their hopes on individual swordsmen's ability to continuously fight for seconds. The three Pure Ones were well aware of this. If they were to say that they were second in terms of time, no one would dare to say that they were first. If the setting was suitable, these 9 people could last until the end of time. If the swordsman thought that he could win in seconds, they would use a method of exhausting their energy. Even if they could not win, they would exhaust their energy until they were unable to fight in the next round. This was the reality of the cultivation world. Even if it was a gambling fight, countless calculations would be involved before both sides could accept the conditions. The defending arena. One side had 9 people. Whoever won would be the champion until they were defeated. In the end, whichever side's 9 people were exhausted would lose. It was very simple. It provided a bigger stage for the powerful cultivators. It also prevented the awkward situation where one side could be defeated in one round, and the rest would not have the chance to fight. It was competitive, interesting, and dramatic. It was said that as soon as such a gambling rule came out, it attracted countless other sects in Irai. Everyone knew that this seemed to be a matter of Kuan-Dao-Li boundary, but in fact, it was a competition between 2 top forces. Everyone suggested to watch the fight. In order to expand their influence, the 3 Pure Ones agreed. This was an event that would further strengthen the 3 Pure Ones' control in Irai. They had no reason to reject. Weijian Mountain felt that they had a chance of winning because they believed in the tradition of swordsmen restraining spell cultivators. Moreover, in Weijian Mountain, there were indeed a few people who had the ability to enter the rankings but kept a low profile. One of them was especially outstanding. His attacks were unusually fierce. The elders in the sect all believed that he had the ability to enter the top 30. This was already a very impressive evaluation. In fact, the difference between the top 30 and the top 10 was not that obvious. They proposed the defending arena system to prepare for this person. They hoped that he could fight against a group of people. However, the order of battle had to be carefully arranged. The 3 Pure Ones were also laughing in their hearts. If they wanted to find someone who could enter the rankings, they could immediately find 100 of them. Of course, they still had to be carefully selected. The 3 Pure Ones also set the standard for the strength of their disciples to be in the top 100. Among the 9 disciples, except for the so-called indigenous man, all of them were strong. At least 3 of them had the strength to be in the top 30. This was not arrogance, but the result of competing with the disciples of the 3 Pure Ones who were already in the top 30 was based on cultivation. Originally, this was only a small matter that involved Kuan-Dao. There were many sects like Kuan-Dao in Irai. However, after years of wrangling between the 2 sides, the 3 Pure Ones finally could not hide anymore. They started to fight. Weijian Mountain also did not hide. They opposed each other. From a small matter, it became a big matter. If Weijian Mountain failed, the reputation of the sword vein would be damaged. When it was their turn to face such a situation in the future, how could they make a comeback? The 3 Pure Ones had also forced themselves into a dead end. The situation was developing uncontrollably. If they failed this time, there would be no need to mention the integration of the tribes or the connection of their hearts. It would be a joke if they did not mention it. Chapter 360. After Han Yen finished picking the crab algae, she went to find her master Zi Jing. Master, there are only a dozen days left before the battle and there are already guests coming. Have we not decided on the candidates for our Kuan-Dao-Li world? Zi Jing looked at his impatient disciple and sighed. The sect was facing a calamity, and his disciple was courageously moving forward, hoping to contribute to the sect. He was in a good mood, but, Han Yen, I might as well tell you that the sect has prepared 2 sets of candidates for this battle. One is a normal plan and the other is an extreme choice in an extreme situation. So far, we have not gotten the list of candidates from the 3 Pure Ones and the list of reinforcements from Weijian Mountain. Because we cannot make a judgment, we have not announced it. Han Yen was confused. Master, is there a difference? Zi Jing smiled bitterly. Of course there is a difference. We also have people in the three pure ones. After getting the name list, he would be able to find out their overall attitude towards this battle. Would they do it at all costs, or would they hold back like they usually did? If they are still going all out, the pressure on us will be less. We only need to deal with it normally and leave the rest to Weijian Mountain. If the three pure ones are serious, the situation will be different. You know that with the strength of the three pure ones, if they really send out their hidden experts, even if they are as strong as Weijian Mountain, it will be hard to guarantee victory. We have to solve our own problems. There is no reason to put all our hopes on the shoulders of our allies. That is not the way of a cultivator. We cannot lose the ownership of Fanting offshore. If we lose, there will be endless trouble in the future. The endless harassment will be the root of the disaster. For this, the extreme plan decided by the higher-ups is to exchange lives for lives. We cannot ask Weijian Mountain to do this, so we can only do it ourselves. When the situation is not right and the opponent is too strong, we will not hesitate to use the method of mutual destruction to exhaust the opponent. 4 people in exchange for 4 lives of the 3 pure ones. This will reduce the pressure on Weijian Mountain to the greatest extent. Our Kun Dao is weak. If we really fight, it will be difficult to win. But at least we cannot cause trouble for our friends. Han Yen, your situation is special, so in the extreme plan. Do you think I should congratulate you? Or be sad? Han Yen did not have any change in her mentality. She knew very well what her master was talking about. She was not human. He had a very special background. They had been brought back by the sect's grand cultivators from the outer reaches. They had grown up on this beautiful island, cultivated here, and lived here. Slowly, they began to view this place as their true home. They had many companions, and they enjoyed countless pleasures. She had completely regarded herself as a human being. If anyone wanted to take away her home, she would never agree. Due to her special background, she had a special ability. However, the senior cultivator who had brought her back had clearly told her that unless she became a Jin Dan, she should not use her natal ability. If she was lucky, she would lose her future, and if she was lucky, she would die on the spot. Her strength was one of the best in the group of Zhuji cultivators in the Kun Daoli world. She was smart and had potential. However, if only 3 people were selected from thousands of Zhuji cultivators, she wouldn't have a place. If a dozen people were selected, there would be a place for her. Under such circumstances, if the sect still chose her, it could only be because they had taken a fancy to her innate special ability. It was an ability that could make the opponent have nowhere to escape to. Therefore, her master hoped that her disciple would contribute to the sect, but she was also sad that if this day really came, it would definitely be an eternal farewell. She was in a dilemma. But in fact, even Zijing could not make this final decision. She needed to look at the specific situation. She was not afraid of death. If she could do something for the sect. She believed that it was not only her, but also the other 3 sisters who were willing to sacrifice themselves. On Fanting Island, there were many sisters like this. Even if they usually looked like they were going on a scenic tour, admiring the moon and flowers, this was a woman's nature. It did not mean that they were afraid of fighting. The key was that it was not something you could sacrifice just because you wanted to. You had to have the ability to pull the opponent along with you. This required a special talent. In the Kun Daoli world, there were not many people who had this kind of talent. She was one of them. This might be a dead end, but it was also a kind of glory. It depended on how you looked at it. Master, if the news from the 3 pure ones is confirmed, should we also remind the Weijian Mountain? Zijing sighed again. Of course, but we can't say too much. We can't tell the swordsman that the opponent is very strong, and you may not be able to win. Therefore, we plan to die together. Do you want to die together? You can't say that. Swordsmen have the pride and dignity of swordsmen. They usually fight with their lives on the line. We have no reason to ask them to be like us. They know that they will die, but they still want to be benevolent. This is our home, not someone else's. They could only remind them indirectly. They could not tell the Weijian mountain about their arrangement. Then, everything would be left to the heavenly way. This was the helplessness of the weak. They had to maintain their pitiful self-esteem in the struggle. Allies also needed to be maintained. They could not be abused. This was the way of the Kun Dao. This attitude allowed them to obtain the strongest support of the Sword Union for thousands of years. Han Yan nodded. She understood what her master meant. She did not regret transforming into a human. Because in the human world she had obtained happiness that she had never had before. However, humans had a habit that she could not understand. They killed each other and schemed against each other. There was beauty and kindness, but there was also ugliness and cruelty. Humans were a complicated creature. They ruled the entire universe in contradiction. Master, I heard that our Kun Daoli world's biggest backer is Xianyuan. Will they come? Xi Jing smiled bitterly. If we need them, they will definitely come. But for the battle, it is useless even if they come. Because of the rules, only the forces in the air-sea area can participate in this battle. Therefore, the internal swords cannot come. If they are only external swords, then they are not as good as the Weijian mountain. Han Yan thought for a moment and asked, Master, I heard from the guests that there is another reason why the three pure ones are finding trouble with us. They suspect that we have a great cultivator who can move the stars and fill the sea. But they keep it a secret in the war and don't contribute to the fifth ring. The principle of the 5 rings in fighting against external forces was that those with money would contribute money, those with manpower, and those with power would contribute strength. The 5 rings' current status in the cultivation world of the universe had been established through fighting. They couldn't rely on the big powers to stand at the front and shoulder everything while the small and medium powers sat behind and took advantage of the situation. On this point, Kun Daoli Realm's contribution to the 5 rings was indeed lackluster. It wasn't just a matter of strength, but also a matter of attitude towards cultivation. Their attitude towards cultivation was somewhat incompatible with the tigers and wolves of the 5th ring. Xi Jing said desolately, The 3 pure ones are finding trouble with our Kun Daoli world because they suspect that we have a half-immortal but don't contribute. Why don't they find trouble with Xianyuan? Because Xianyuan really has won. Chapter 361. 10 days was not a long time for cultivators. Han Yan's daily routine was the same. Every day, she would gather crabs with her sisters and cultivate as usual. She was not afraid of death, but it did not mean that she wanted to die. After understanding the sect's intention, she was also very afraid, but she would not back down. She hoped that the sect could safely get through this, and she also hoped that she could be safe. However, all of this did not seem to be up to her. In these few days, more and more cultivators came from various small and medium-sized sects in Irai. Their composition was complicated, but she could feel that most of them had hope for this battle. They hoped that the battle between Kun Daoli World and Weijian Mountain would succeed. This would also point out a path for them in the future. The 3 pure ones did not have many allies. They were very confident in the outcome of this battle. In the world of self-cultivators, confidence was built on strength. After tens of thousands of years of living together, many things were not difficult to guess and could be seen at a glance. Han Yan and the other 7 cultivators were assigned to a group. They were prepared to receive the cultivators of the 3 pure ones and Weijian Mountain. They were actually all participants. One group had 4 people and 2 groups. One group was for normal battles while the other group had secret techniques and was prepared to die together. Different sects had different methods for the upcoming opponents. Some would choose not to meet before the battle, some would be willing to understand more about the opponent, and some would completely ignore them. This was related to the orthodoxy's battle preference. There was no better method. Kun Daoli World did not have as much killing intent as the other orthodoxies, so they walked the path of understanding more. This was the reason why the 8 of them came out in advance. In any case, it was the benefit of being the host. What Han Yan was most concerned about was not these, but the 3 sisters who were prepared to sacrifice themselves like her. She was not familiar with them, but she could see that these three sisters were real humans. They were fearless of death like her. They were curious about each other, but they did not probe each other. They respected each other's space. Cultivators talked about the state of mind. In a sense, the state of mind was a kind of psychology. For a person who was willing to sacrifice himself, this was a process of continuous self-hypnosis, self-improvement, self-encouragement, and self-deepening, when a few people who were willing to sacrifice themselves really gathered together, communicated with each other, told each other about their experiences, and poured out their worries. This was going to be bad. Most likely, they would have this thought, so there is someone who is more bitter than me. If that's the case, why should I? The state of mind was a wonderful thing. Even if you were willing, even if you had already made up your mind, you still needed skills to maintain this kind of willpower. As long as you were a living creature, you would have the will to live. It was impossible to maintain a state of fighting to the death forever. This was also the reason why the sect had only informed them at the very last moment. If the notice was given months or years in advance, the waiting time alone was enough to drive people crazy. He ran away. He was terrified. He was only at the foundation establishment stage. He still had a long way to go in terms of mental toughness. There were still 3 days before the official start of the battle. The cultivators of the three pure ones arrived on a boat. There were more than 20 of them, and they were led by 3 Jean Dan cultivators. Among the remaining cultivators, it was unknown who would participate in the battle and who would not. With a simple move, the experienced and ruthless Dharma Meridians destroyed the illusion of the Kun Dao cultivators, leaving the boundary to sense their opponents in advance. In this aspect, they were the teachers, and the Kun Dao cultivators were the students. In this battle, the great cultivators from both sides would not appear. They would stop at the Jean Dan. This was also a tacit understanding between everyone. The cultivators of the three pure ones were arranged into a group of individual guest houses. The Jean Dan elders of the Kun Dao separation boundary decisively stopped their own disciples from coming into contact with each other. This kind of contact with an unknown target would instead cause suspicion among the disciples, affect their judgment, and shake their determination. It was better not to do it. There was another reason. That afternoon, the swordsmen of Weijian Mountain arrived. A Jean Dan led 5 swordsmen, not one more, not one less. This was the style of the sword vein. It was completely different from that of the Dharma Meridians. The Kun Dao separation boundary's welcome was low-key and sincere. Towards true friends, of course there was a way to be friends. Han Yen followed her sisters and brought the swordsmen to the most beautiful water cloud pavilion on Fangting Island. From now on, they were close comrades. In the cruelty of the battle arena, everyone's performance was very important. They needed to understand each other in order to display their greatest battle strength. For tens of thousands of years, the Kun Dao separation boundary had been very close to Weijian Mountain. This kind of closeness was not because of how many of their disciples had become Dao companions. This was only one aspect. It was also because of many specific things in cultivation. For example, the pills and floating rafts that the Kun Dao separation boundary was most proficient in would be sent to Weijian Mountain. This allowed the swordsman who was clumsy in these aspects to benefit greatly. However, not every Kun Dao disciple had contact with a swordsman. After all, their orthodoxies were different and their philosophies were different. It was impossible for them to cultivate together. Other than some special Kun Dao cultivators who often had contact with swordsmen, the others had long heard of swordsmen but were actually unfamiliar with them. For example, Han Yen had never come into contact with a swordsman. This made her a little curious. What were these people who fought all day and dealt with death made of? Did they not look forward to a stable and peaceful cultivation life and live a carefree life in happiness? The 5 swordsmen each had their own characteristics. One was forthright and iron-blooded, one was cold and heartless, one was calm and composed, one was elegant and refined, and one was fresh and looked around like a curious baby. Han Yen was not human, so she especially trusted her intuition. She could feel in the eyes of this curious baby that he liked the surrounding natural environment from the bottom of his heart. This made her accept him at the first moment. This person was very young and his cultivation level was the lowest among the 5 swordsmen. In fact, he was also the lowest among the 10 cultivators present who could participate in the battle. He was only in the middle stage of foundation establishment. Each orthodoxy had their own way of determining a cultivator's age and cultivation base. If the other party did not deliberately conceal it, this was also not a difficult matter. Therefore, Han Yen was able to determine that this young sword cultivator was the youngest among the cultivators present. His cultivation base was also the lowest. He was so young that under normal sex, this kind of disciple should only have some success in his studies and should be traveling everywhere to increase his knowledge. This kind of young cultivator was actually very unsuitable to participate in this kind of battle. If his cultivation level was insufficient, it would inevitably affect his strength. If he did not have enough knowledge, he would lack experience. However, this was not something she should consider. Wei Sword Mountain was not like the 3 pure ones. They only had 5 swordsmen here, which meant that he would definitely participate in the battle. She hoped that this young swordsman would not be young and hot-blooded and lose his life here in a moment of impulse. She was willing to sacrifice herself because this was her home. However, this young swordsman did not need to sacrifice himself. A trace of pity floated in her heart, and she walked over. "What is your name? Being able to work for the sect at such a young age, you will definitely be a pillar of the sect in the future." The young swordsman looked back. His eyes, which had been filled with nature, were immediately replaced by a beautiful woman. She replaced him very quickly. Nature. However, the words that came out of his mouth made Han Yen unable to guess. Coming out to work at such a young age, it could also be that the master is destroying child labor. He might not be a pillar of the sect, but he is definitely being used as a good-for-nothing now. How should I address you, little sister? This one is Wei Sword Mountain's Fei Chai. It is fate that we meet today. Chapter 362. Han Yen was stunned. How could she not hear the dissatisfaction in the young swordsman's tone? This should not be something a loyal disciple would say to the sect. Or was he just not satisfied with working for Boding Ting Island? If the swordsman sent by Weijian Mountain had this kind of mentality, then it was not easy to answer this kind of question, so she could only change the topic. The sect has its own considerations, right? As disciples, we can't make wild guesses about these things. I'm Han Yen. Thank you for everything Weijian Mountain has done for our Kun Dao. Fei Chai curled his lips. The sect's considerations? It's just that there's selfishness in the official business. If we as disciples don't think more, we won't even know if we're sold out. Han Yen, this name is really fated. You don't have to thank Weijian Mountain. It's more practical to thank us unlucky people directly. Han Yen finally understood what was going on. She was hinting that she wanted benefits. Directly? Practically? What did that mean? If it was just spirit stones, the sect would not be stingy, and she would not be stingy. But what if it was something else? For example, some unreasonable and excessive requests? She knew very well that although Weijian Mountain had always been the most staunch ally of the Kun Dao Li Jia, and most of the swordsmen's personal morals were unquestionable, this did not mean that there were no black sheep in Weijian Mountain. Not to mention Weijian Mountain, even Xianyuan was the same. When there were many people, there would be all kinds of birds. There were precedents to follow. The initial good impression had disappeared, but the Kun Dao disciple who paid attention to personal quality would not show all this on her face. She still asked softly, "If Junior Marshal Brother Fei Chai has any requests, you can tell me. Han Yen will do her best. If you can't do it, there's still the sect's help. What's so difficult about it?" She was hinting that if he made any excessive requests, she would report it to the sect. Fei Chai's eyes lit up. "I've been dealing with wine and meat every day in Weijian Mountain. It's all wine and meat barrels. I really can't stand it. Senior sister, do you have any bland, sweet, and sour food? Do you have candied haws? Han Yan's heart softened. The ill will that originally welled up disappeared without a trace. This was clearly a child that had not yet grown up. His will was not strong, and he was still infatuated with the candied haws that even mortals would only eat as children. Of course, they didn't have candied haws here, but that didn't mean they couldn't make it. For those who loved to cook, this was not a difficult task at all. Wait here, I'll go make some for you. Han Yan floated away, leaving Fei Chai smacking his lips. This unlucky name doesn't sound good at all. He got a cigarette butt in Xianyuan and a Fei Chai in Weijian Mountain. Was this his fate? Lu Xiaoyi was too absorbed in his cultivation at the dome, so he forgot to go down the mountain to buy some fresh sugar-coated haws before he left. It was better to eat it fresh. Although it was not spoiled after being stored in the storage ring for a few years, it always tasted wrong. After all, marinated braised meat was different from fresh fruit with syrup, so the shelf life was different. When he came to Weijian Mountain, it was truly a bandit's den. It was even more excessive than Xianyuan. They were very enthusiastic and ate fish and meat every day. They were not happy until they were drunk. This was the style of Weijian Mountain. They did not hide it. But where could he find candied haws in such a place? Time was tight, so he came to Fantying Island. He thought that the food in such a beautiful place would not be too greasy. Not long after, Han Yan floated back. Because it was too rushed, she only made 10 sticks of candied haws. Fei Chai carefully took one stick and put it in his mouth with a look of enjoyment. Han Yan sighed. It was really worrisome. She did not know why the Wei Sword Mountain sent such a young sword cultivator. Delicious! It's really delicious! It's better than all the candied haws I've eaten in the past few decades. Lu Xiaoyi praised. This was the truth because the candied haws here were not the same as the ones outside. Han Yan said softly. Ocean Emperor honey and ice silk fruit. The candied haws made from them are naturally different from the ones in the mortal world. The fresh ingredients in the kitchen are limited, so I only made 10 sticks. Seeing Lu Xiaoyi carefully put the remaining 9 candied haws into his storage ring with a reluctant look on his face, he couldn't help but chuckle. Junior brother Fei Chai, eat a few more. When the battle is over and we win, I'll go gather more ingredients for you. I'll make sure you have enough. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. Only when we win? If we lose, there won't be any? You can't judge a hero based on victory or defeat, right? Who hasn't lost before? Life has to go on. Han Yan sighed. It was good to be young and carefree. However, if this was Weijian Mountain's crisis, would he still be able to maintain this childlike innocence? If he lost, of course there wouldn't be any because that would mean she was no longer here. Maybe the other sisters could help him? Lu Xiaoyi counted with his fingers and sighed with satisfaction. 1 stick per match, 9 sticks per match. Just right, this is a good omen. The Foundation establishment cultivators were waiting, but the Jin Dan still had to solve the problem of how to arrange the troops. At this time, the 3 Pure Ones had basically figured out the details of the cultivators, and the situation was not optimistic. A fellow Taoist who had a deep relationship with the 3 Pure Ones said that among the nearly 20 Foundation establishment cultivators, there were some true powerhouses that the 3 Pure Ones had always kept a secret. Although they did not know which 9 of the 3 Pure Ones would send out in the end, the situation was very obvious. Those who came did not come with good intentions. Kun Dao Jin Dan silently selected the people for the second plan, but he could not say this. If he did, it would be disrespectful to the swordsmen of Weijian Mountain, so he could only do it silently. However, the information about the cultivators of the 3 Pure Ones still accurately reached the ears of Weijian Mountain's Jin Dan and Taoist Yin Yi. 9 people, what does Taoist Yin Yi think about the arrangement? In this kind of battle, the vanguard and the arena master were very important. The vanguard needed to win the battle to raise morale, and the arena master needed to ensure the final victory. Of course, The most important thing was definitely the arena master and vice arena master. This was the key to success or failure. Yi did not consider the battle prowess of the cultivators of Kun Daoli world. After being together for tens of thousands of years, who did not know each other's background. They were actually here to be bystanders, so all the burden would be placed on Weijian Mountain. Swordsmen were of course not afraid of pressure. The greater the pressure, the more passionate they would be. Therefore, Yi was actually only considering the arrangement of the 5 swordsmen. There was a problem here. The external sword from Xianyuan was too young, and his cultivation was not enough. His swordsmanship was probably not that strong. Weijian Mountain admired Xianyuan very much, but they only admired the internal sword. They had never put Xuanyuan's external sword in their eyes. Even so, there were some things that needed to be considered. For example, no matter how bad Xuanyuan's external sword was, it was supported by Xuanyuan's name, and could not be ignored. This represented the problem of the sex status. Perhaps Xianyuan was far away and did not know that this matter was getting bigger and bigger, so they sent such a young swordsman to learn. Only the disciples of Weijian Mountain were truly trustworthy. My Weijian Mountain will fight for the 1st, 2nd, 7th, 8th, and 9th battle. The rest will be arranged by Kun Dao. Daoist friend, what do you think? Chapter 363. P.S. Cui Mei, you have to know that this old man is old and can't resist anymore. Yi's plan was very simple. Xianyuan and Wei Jianshan would each occupy one position. He was afraid that Xuanyuan's external sword wouldn't be strong enough, so he arranged his side's most suitable vanguard for the second match. He thought that it would be able to recover the lost morale. The remaining 3 swordsmen would be the last to defend the arena. As for the Kun Dao cultivators, they couldn't count on them too much. If they could defeat 1, it wouldn't be bad. If they could defeat 2, it would be a victory. Kun Dao Jin Dan was very clear about what he meant, but in terms of battle, Kun Dao cultivators really didn't have any right to speak. After 10,000 years, these bloody things were done by the sword vein, so they were already used to it. Their plan was not to rely on numbers to defeat 1 or 2 opponents, but to destroy all 4 of them. However, there was no need to say these words. Even the weak had dignity. Fei Chai, you're first in line. I'm only 3rd. It's not easy to be the vanguard. This means that Marshal Uncle Yi thinks highly of you. In fact, I think that you don't need to take this too seriously. There are still 8 martial brothers and sisters behind you. It doesn't matter whether you win or lose. After 2 days of getting along, Han Yan was somewhat familiar with this young swordsman. She didn't want such a young life to be destroyed here, so she gave him a chance to vent his pressure. Lu Xiaoyu was very angry. He had to be the vanguard again. Nothing good could escape from him. How could he live like this? I don't want to be the vanguard. I want to be the champion. Han Yan chuckled. It's not easy to be the champion. You need to take responsibility. Fei Chai, are you that confident in yourself? Lu Xiaoyu shook his head. How could I be confident? The only reason I want to be the champion is because I can win without fighting. Isn't it good to save energy? I'm very good at cheering people on. I'm also good at scolding people. Generally, no one can scold me. I'm very talented in this area. Han Yan was once again speechless. The way this junior swordsman spoke was very strange, but she knew that he didn't have any bad intentions. He just liked to complain, complaining that the heavens were unfair and the earth was unfair. He was a little lazy. It doesn't matter. If you can't beat them, then retreat. With your middle stage cultivation, no one will say anything if you retreat. Marshal Uncle Yi won't blame you either, right? Just treat it as accumulating experience. If you have any grudges, I'll avenge you. Lu Xiaoyu sighed. This silly girl was so innocent that she was cute. Where could he retreat to? There was no retreat. Xuanyuan's curtain was covering his face. How could he retreat? Yi wouldn't say anything to him because it wasn't his business. However, it was hard to say what would happen when he returned to Xianyuan. A large group of people were waiting to send him missions to torture him. Thank you, Senior Sister. However, there is no need for Senior Sister to take revenge. But after the battle, I would like to tour the scenery of Tinghai. I wonder if Senior Sister could show me the way? Han Yan's heart was sour. How could she still have a future? She was the third to go on stage because the sect thought highly of her innate ability. She was extremely confident that she could complete the Tonggui attack. This was to express her determination to leave the realm. Not only her, but the other three sisters as well. Their mission was to use their own lives to pave the way for the last swordsman to defend the arena. Death was certain. She had never lied in her life, but this time, she couldn't tell the truth. All right, I promise you. At the Three Pure Ones guest house, the three Jin Dan confirmed the final name list. As expected, the ones who went up were the strongest. Dharma cultivators were all stubborn old men. They stuck to the rules and treated the rules as more important than the heavens. Therefore, their ranking was actually very simple. It was based on strength from the weakest to the strongest. It seemed stupid, but in the face of strength, it was the best method. One of the three pure Jin Dan Taoists flicked his finger, indicating for everyone to pay attention. Using a butcher's knife to kill a chicken is the main theme of our Three Pure Ones' actions this time. Tell me, if there is an accident, where will it happen? The 9 Foundation establishment cultivators looked at each other, starting from the strongest arena master. Abnormalities in the small space of the battle, mutual return technique, internal sword infiltration? The Foundation establishment cultivators thought about it very thoroughly. The 3 pure Jin Dan nodded in satisfaction. This was how battle should be. There was no fear in battle, but before the battle, one had to consider all possible scenarios. Only then could one have a comprehensive response. Swordsmen were not afraid of death. The 3 pure ones could also find disciples who were willing to contribute to the sect. Once one reached the Foundation establishment realm, one had to start building one's Tao heart. How did one build one's Tao heart? It was through constant life and death experiences that swordsmen understood this point. How could the Dharma cultivators not understand it? It was just that there were more ways for the Dharma cultivators to build their Tao heart, while swordsmen only had the same method of life and death. In comparison, swordsmen were more unafraid of death. Everyone was afraid of death. The key was who could persist in pretending not to be afraid of death the longest. This was the truth of swordsmen's fearlessness. In this aspect, the Dharma cultivators were slowly catching up. They might never be able to pretend to be swordsmen, but if the gap between them narrowed, and supplemented with other methods, the swordsmen's so-called restraint over the Dharma cultivators was slowly disappearing. This was what the 3 pure ones had been doing for tens of thousands of years. They had analyzed the advantages of the swordsmen over the Dharma cultivators countless times, and realized that there were very few things that really depended on the characteristics of the technique, and more on the mentality. Thus, they went straight to the point. There's no need to worry about the small space of the battle. This is the 3 pure ones' strength. If we don't want to do anything, then no one can do anything. There's no need to worry about Xianyuan. They can't interfere in this battle. If the 5 external swords all come from Xianyuan, then it's good news for you, not bad news. But there's one point. Regarding the art of mutual return, Marshal Nephew Gao Liang's opinion is very insightful. But in my opinion, the swordsman's art of mutual return cannot change the outcome. The only thing that can change the outcome is the art of mutual return of the Kuan Dao cultivators. If the Kuan Dao cultivators are no longer their weakness, then this battle will truly become a battle between the 3 pure ones and the Weijian mountain. I believe that we can win, but it will be tragic. I don't want it to come to that. Another Jin Dan also smiled and said, through certain channels, we also vaguely know that the 4 Kuan Dao cultivators from the Kuan Dao Li realm are not simple. They may have some kind of secret technique that can achieve a certain level of mutual destruction. We don't know the specific technique, but the general strategy will not be wrong. Regarding this, you have to be mentally prepared. The 3 pure ones were speechless. How could they be prepared? Fighting methods like mutual destruction were the ultimate fighting methods used by cultivators when they were forced into a corner. It was often accompanied by some kind of mystery that was difficult to guard against. If they were constantly on guard against this, then there was no need for the battle arena. How much of their strength could they use? Of course, guarding against the opponent's life and death struggle was also one of the cultivator's fighting abilities. You couldn't say that this fighting method was against the rules, but it was more extreme. The key point was that the common cultivators who were forced into mutual destruction were not the same concept as the ones who were specially selected out of thousands of Foundation establishment cultivators to do so. This must be because they had some kind of mysterious ability and a special confidence. This kind of exchange didn't mean much in a battle between cultivators, because killing 1,000 of the enemy would cause 1,000 of your own to suffer 1,000 losses. It couldn't change the direction of the battle. But in this kind of battle arena system, its power was endless. You can't run. Chapter 364. P.S. Brat, why are you joining in the fun? Do you believe that I will give you a reverse corner and let little E train you to death? Finally, the leader, Jean Dan, coughed lightly. All right, don't scare them anymore. We already have a way to perish together with the Kun Daoli realm, and that is to start in the battle space. This time, the battle space will be provided by a third party, the Tai Heaven sect. We will make arrangements to add 2 auxiliary spaces in the battle space. All the participating cultivators will wait in the auxiliary spaces. This is for the fairness of both sides. There will be no interference or guidance from outside cultivators. Everything will depend on oneself. A Foundation establishment cultivator still did not quite understand. Marshal Uncle, is there any special function? The leader, Jean Dan, said righteously. What function? Of course, it will not be of any help to you. Don't think about reaping without sowing. We, the 3 pure ones, are open and above board. We will never do such sneaky things. If you want to win and win glory for the sect, you can only rely on your own true abilities. This is the foundation of the 3 pure ones, the source of our inheritance. He was blowing his beard and glaring at them to show his nobility. Next to him, Jean Dan chuckled. You must understand what senior marshal brother means. Being open and above board has always been the symbol of the 3 pure ones. You must never forget it. The auxiliary space is mainly used to accommodate you participating disciples. It can make the battle more continuous and compact, and it will not be disturbed by the outside world. Of course, it also has an auxiliary function. It can spread the mysterious lock of a cultivator to everyone in the space. The Foundation establishment cultivators understood tacitly. For example, some special techniques of mutual destruction were usually used when one was on the verge of death. The idea was to pull someone away. Most of these secret techniques had a common characteristic, and that was the problem of how to lock onto the opponent. Of course, they would not use ordinary methods to lock onto the opponent. This was because when a cultivator was forced to this point, their magic power and spirit would definitely be on the verge of collapse. Otherwise, they would not risk their lives. Basically, the method used was to mysteriously lock onto the opponent. At the cost of one's life, this mysterious power was used to make the targeted person have nowhere to escape, especially in such a closed battle space. The original space was only occupied by the 2 of them. Once it was locked on, there was nowhere to run. However, if there were 18 cultivators in the space, including the ancillary space, and one of them used the mutual destruction technique, the mysterious lock-on would become 17 targets. In that case, it would be more like suicide. Jean Dan reminded them again. Not every method of mutual destruction relies on a mysterious lock. There are countless unimaginable secret methods in the cultivation world, and there must be other methods. However, an occasional example will not affect the overall situation. If any of you encounter such a situation, I have a suggestion. Let me tell you something. In a battle of life and death, Whoever was more afraid of death would die faster. Our 3 Pure One's secret techniques are unrivaled at the 5-ring level. No one can compare to us. Others can risk their lives, but we can't? I hope that all of you will be able to distinguish your gains and losses, be brave and fearless, and bring out the momentum of the 3 Pure Ones. When the time comes, I will also be able to claim credit for all of you in Lunghuan blessed land. The next day, Tenghai was calm and tranquil. There were no clouds in the sky. It was another sunny day. Dozens of miles away from Tenghai, a transparent circular space appeared on the surface of the sea. With a diameter of 10 miles, it was an empty space. There were no mountains, rivers, greenery, or trees. This was the official competition space of the 5-ring level. Because some cultivators were afraid that the environment would be beneficial to them, and some would be detrimental to them, there was nothing at all. It was like a small void. With a diameter of 10 miles, it was enough for both a spell cultivator and a swordsman. The spherical space was like a person's head. There were even 2 small space bubbles at the side of the ears. This was a place for the other cultivators to stay. It was to separate them from the spectators and prevent any unfairness from occurring. For example, Jin Dan's elders would give advice to their disciples. Here, everything depended on oneself. You could only rely on yourself. The fighting style was to defend the ring. The winner would stay, and the loser would leave. There were 3 ways to lose: death, admitting defeat, and the Jin Dan stage cultivators outside would admit defeat on behalf of their own disciples. Therefore, it was not a true death match. This was also a small scheme of the Kun Dao. We, the Kun Dao, are not afraid of death, but are you, the 3 Pure Ones? If you are not, then let's perish together. If you are, then admit defeat. The control of this space was controlled by a third-party cultivator. It was the Jin Dan of the Tai Heavenly sect. All the influence on the cultivators in the space was done by him alone. Of course, this was done under the eyes of hundreds of spectators outside. Among them, there was no lack of experienced Jin Dan. It was harder than ascending to the heavens to tamper with it. Under the joint oath of the Jin Dan of the 3 Pure Ones and the Jin Dan of the Kun Dao, Tai Jin Dan announced the establishment of the bet. The combatants from both sides entered the ears of the battle space and waited for the battle to begin. At this moment, a strange Jin Dan cultivator with a kind smile on his face came to the side of the Kun Dao and the Weijian mountain and gave them an important reminder. Be careful of the 2 heavy ears. The role of the 2 small spaces is not only to accommodate other cultivators, but also to disperse the mysterious power. In other words, if someone wants to perish together, I'm afraid he will be disappointed. Don't thank me. I'm just a kind-hearted passerby who can't stand some filthy things. The man turned and left, leaving Yin Yi a little confused. However, the expression of the Jin Dan of the Kun Dao changed slightly. Yin Yi saw the change in the expression of the Jin Dan of the Kun Dao and reacted instantly. Fellow cultivator, why do you, the Kun Dao, have to do this? Do you not trust the Weijian mountain? The Jin Dan of the Kun Dao said tiredly. Sorry. We just want to do our part. After all, it's the trouble of the Kun Dao, and it can make the Weijian mountain more relaxed, but we didn't expect. Yin Yi frowned, but he couldn't complain. After all, this was an ally who was using his own death to pave the way for the gamble. Such an ally was of course fine, but he would pay a meaningless death. Originally, they could have made better arrangements. In some unorthodox ways, the weakness of the swordsman's ability was undoubtedly exposed, and the overall strength of the Kun Dao was not enough, so they fell into such a trap. Now that the oath had been made, how could they go back on it in front of so many people? There were some things that couldn't be explained. Things were getting more and more out of control. He knew the virtues of the swordsman of the Weijian mountain. He had always considered himself as the protector of the Kun Dao, plus some feelings of pity for the fairer sex. If he saw the female swordsman self-destruct in order to hurt the enemy, his heroic spirit would burst out. Unless he won, the last 3 swordsmen would not be able to survive. If the women could risk their lives, why couldn't the swordsmen? The control of the coastal waters was lost without hurting the foundation, but they could find another opportunity to take it back. This was also something that could not be said. If this happened to the Weijian mountain, would they think this way? They would definitely fight to the death. Who is the Jin Dan that delivered the message? Is he unfamiliar? I don't remember there being such a person in Irai. Jin Dan, who was in charge of this matter in the Kuan Daoli realm, could be considered to have a wide range of friends, but he had no impression of this person at all. Yi snorted disdainfully. He's not from our Irai, so of course you haven't seen him. I could smell his jealousy from afar. Who else in the 5 rings would dare to undermine the 3 pure ones behind their backs? Humph, why didn't he say it earlier or later? He had to wait until the oath was made and the people were sent in. He obviously wants us to fight to the death, and then he can reap the benefits. Chapter 365. P.S. Brute, we're old acquaintances. Take it easy, you'll get killed. Lu Xiaoyu was in a small space. He felt that not only was his spiritual connection with the cultivators outside cut off, he couldn't even sense his other 8 companions. The mysteries of space were not something he could understand at the moment. He felt that his celestial powers were not affected at all. This was what he was most concerned about. If the celestial powers in this space were to be obstructed, there was no need to fight. He could just admit defeat. The space in front of him began to loosen. He knew that this was a sign that the first battle was about to begin. He squeezed his body forward, and under the guidance of the starlight, he passed through the center of the spherical space. He continued to move forward with the 4 Seasons spear. In the next moment, the 4 Seasons spear found its target. The cultivator opposite him was the indigenous cultivator of the 3 pure ones. He was also the weakest among the cultivators of the 3 pure ones. The reason he participated in this battle was not because of his strength, but because he was using his identity. As a cultivator of the 3 pure ones, even if his strength was average, he knew that the swordsmen liked to take the initiative. They were fast, and their flying swords were fast. It was almost certain that they would attack first. It was difficult for a spell cultivator to fight for the first strike. He didn't pursue this. In the small space, he put on 7 or 8 sets of defensive spells, talismans, magic weapons, spells, and even a spiritual pet. Once the space opened, he tried his best to fight forward. He knew that even if he couldn't win against the swordsman, he had to. The further he fought, the more room he had to maneuver. Otherwise, if he was pressed against the walls of the space, he wouldn't be able to fight. Before entering the arena space, Marshal Uncle Jindan had already told him that his first battle was to put on a show to show the origin of the matter. He just had to admit defeat after a few rounds. It was to fight for a sense of existence, and he was a representative of the indigenous people's rights. But he had his own pride. How could he surrender without a fight? Especially when the opponent was only a mid-stage cultivator. So his idea was to fight first. If he could fight, he would fight and try to win. If he admitted defeat after realizing that he was no match for the swordsman, there were still elders of the 3 pure ones outside. They would be able to see clearly if there was anything wrong with the swordsman. So, it was very safe. It was a simple idea, but once he stepped out of the small space, he was hit in the head. Because he realized that all his defenses were gone. This was another ancillary function of the small space. It was also for the sake of fairness. Only when a cultivator entered the large space to fight could they begin to buff themselves, set up defenses, and throw attacks. They didn't have to carry a turtle shell into the large space. He didn't know. He was not a spell cultivator who specialized in battle, so his experience in this area was limited. His mental fortitude was even more limited. His uncle master had never mentioned this to him. In a fluster, his body was still flying forward according to his previous thoughts. Then, he hurriedly set up a defense for himself. At this moment, he was locked on by the flying sword. It was only now that he discovered that he had rushed forward a bit too fiercely. Or, it could be said that his opponent had rushed forward even more fiercely. In the blink of an eye, the distance between the two sides had closed to less than 3,000 feet. In the next moment, the Four Seasons arrived before him. He shouldn't have rushed. Realizing that he didn't have any defensive spells, he shouldn't have rushed. He should have moved along the walls of the space to add a few more layers of protection. Even if he admitted defeat, at least he would have time to shout. He only had time to cast 4 or 5 layers of defense, and the casting speed was still the fastest, but it was also the most unreliable. Under the sharp flying sword, it did not even have the effect of slowing down the enemy before it was pierced through in one strike. Piercing through his heart, Lu Xiaoyi stretched out his hand, intending to swing his sword and add another blow. However, he did not expect that this guy, who had rushed over aggressively, was completely useless upon contact. The sword chi that burst out when the flying sword pierced through directly blew a big hole in his heart. How could he add another blow? He didn't even touch his sword. Instead, he took out a stick of sugar-coated haws to knock him out. This guy really had a lot of blood. There was almost no process to this attack. It reduced the dazzling battles of the cultivation world to the point where it was boring. It was like a street thug running over and smashing a scholar who had just woken up with a brick. The crowd didn't quite react. They thought it was the beginning, but it was the end. They had just sat down on the bench and reached for the sunflower seeds, and it was already over? Return to your space. The next round will start from the small space again. Tai Jin Dan's expression didn't change. It was impossible to tell which side he was leaning towards. The nature of his space made it so that the two auxiliary functions didn't favor either side. Scattered gods were disadvantageous to a swordsman's indiscriminate destruction. However, they could only activate their offensive and defensive spells inside the space, which was very advantageous to a fast swordsman. This was because a swordsman relied on 2 things to fight: speed and flying swords. On the other hand, a spell cultivator was much more troublesome. A series of talismans, a series of magic tools and spiritual treasures, and a series of spells. Unless one could use them instantaneously, it was very difficult to use all of them in front of a fast swordsman. Of course, nothing was absolute. On one hand, Lu Xiaoyi's speed was too fast, and he didn't pause to switch to sword riding mode. On the other hand, this native cultivator was a little slow. His speed was slow, and his spell casting was even slower. Normally, it wouldn't be obvious, but in this critical moment, being slow was a sin. Lu Xiaoyi flew back while licking the sugar-coated haws. It wasn't that he had to act like this. It was that he had to borrow something to cover up his awkwardness of fainting at the sight of so many people. What was the best cover? It was the perverted and bloodthirsty sugar-coated haws. He had to pull everyone's impression of him away from fainting at the sight of blood and change it into a psychopathic demon. Once people found out about his fainting at the sight of blood, they would have the best way to deal with him. One person would bait him with injuries, while the other would kill him, or even spit out blood himself, or use a similar blood Dao technique. The sugar-coated haws were just right. It could reduce the duration of fainting at the sight of blood, and it could also create the illusion of a pervert, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. The Kun Dao side won the first round. Although the process was astonishingly fast, it didn't exceed the predictions of the people below. They were all non-elite cultivators from various sections. The 3 pure ones had other missions, while the Wei Sword Mountain swordsman was a middle-stage cultivator. The 2 of them were evenly matched, but it was obvious that the swordsman was better at fighting, so it wasn't surprising that the spell cultivator was defeated so easily. Only the 3 pure ones and the other 2 golden core stage cultivators were able to see this clearly. This was because they knew that the 5 layers of defense of this native cultivator were not as stable as a mountain, but it was enough for a middle-stage foundation establishment stage sword cultivator. The swordsman's sword is very strong. The leader, Jin Dan, had a serious expression. Another Jin Dan comforted. Senior brother, don't worry. The remaining 8 disciples won't make such a low-level mistake. As long as he can withstand the swordsman's first 3 strikes, he won't be able to hold on for long. However, that fellow Taoist from Taiyi is sitting on the fence. He didn't tell us all about the additional functions of this space. The leader, Jin Dan, had an ashen expression. He was the one who found Taiyi, and he had some friendship with him. It was obvious that he had been tricked. This Taoist Taiyi didn't side with either side from the start. He chose to sit on the fence between the 3 pure ones and the Xianyuan. He had already agreed to the 3 pure ones' request. What more do you want? I can't tell you all about the secrets of this space, right? Chapter 366. P.S. Uncle, you're wrong. Why don't we go back and discuss this? You're in the league, and I'll add 2 more chapters for you? Lu Xiaoyi slowly returned to the small space, just as he finished eating the candied haws. He hoped that this problem of his would change after he reached a higher level. It was too out of place and was detrimental to his image. When he was in the Chi Eater stage, his blood faintness was very obvious. Now that he was in the foundation establishment stage, it was much better. He could use other methods to cover it up. He didn't know when he would be able to get rid of this awkwardness. The battle had just begun. He could guess that the second cultivator wouldn't be so simple, but he still wouldn't change his strategy. Once he started fighting, it meant that he couldn't continue. Because of his damned mana, because he didn't have much experience in swordsmanship. Fortunately, in the space, others couldn't sense the presence of the sword spirit on his sword. He didn't have to wait for long. The winner had limited time to return to the small space. Otherwise, it would be obvious that Jin Dan, who was in charge of the space, was biased. The principle was that the winner couldn't be given time to recover his mana. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a challenge, but a one-on-one duel with unlimited mana. Lu Xiaoyi became more and more familiar with this. Before the space fully opened, he rushed out while it was still half closed. He used the starlight escape technique several times and passed through the center of the circle. As usual, a flying sword flew out of the box. But this time, his opponent learned his lesson and didn't rush forward. He probably also felt that he couldn't beat the swordsman. Once he was out of the space, he moved along the walls of the space and began to put on defense. In the 3 pure ones' internal practice, he was already able to attack and defend against cultivators ranked in the top 300. Although there was still a difference between practice and actual combat, the difference wasn't too big with his basic skills. His strategy was correct. He cast spells in an orderly manner. Having learned from the mistakes of his predecessors, he was not at all surprised by the empty state after exiting the space. Therefore, when Lu Xiaoyi entered the attack range, this Dharma cultivator of the 3 pure ones had just completed his full set of preparations. He saw the swordsman killed just now and knew that his opponent's first attack was very heavy. This was a non-standard fighting style that shifted the focus of the attack to the beginning of the battle. It was rare, but not rare for the swordsman. But this time, the other party sent 2 sword pellets flying over. Was it one heavy and one light? Or maybe one was lighter and one was heavier? He didn't believe that this middle-stage foundation establishment cultivator had the ability to send out 2 heavy swords in succession. In the cultivation world, you have to rely on basic common sense. He could not exaggerate the terror of his opponent. That would put him in an eternal and unnecessary fear. The fact that he was in the middle stage of foundation establishment meant that the time he had to practice the sword was limited. Mastering the first flying sword's penetrative power was already inconceivable, let alone mastering 2. That was a flying sword. It was a flying sword that required a sword formation to be inscribed on it. It was something that required endless time to nurture, practice, and improve. Take his own artifacts, for example. He could afford dozens of artifacts, but could he refine each artifact to the point of perfection? This was the basic law of the cultivation world, and no one could go against it. Therefore, he made 2 preparations. One hand formed a talisman to continue setting up the defensive array, while the other took out a magic artifact to prepare for a counterattack. He was someone who advocated offense, and did not like to allow others to act recklessly and make him fall into a passive position. This was a very correct philosophy, but the prerequisite was that you had to be able to block your opponent's flying sword. Lu Xiaoyi had practiced the sword for 30 years, and all his achievements were in the sharpness of his sword. In terms of sword formation and cultivation, his flying sword was in the category of normal external swords, but he had additional bonuses. Sword spirit bonuses. 37. 7 Imbalance Fulcrum. The addition of the star's sword force. These 3 bonuses caused his sword force to completely break away from the normal category, becoming incomprehensibly heavy, unimaginably heavy. Others could not see this kind of heaviness, only those who had experienced it personally would know. Unfortunately, the first 3 Pure One's cultivator had died too quickly and had no way to tell this secret to his companions. In an instant, the sword force was unstoppable. All the defenses were unable to withstand a single blow after surpassing its endurance. The cultivator felt that something was wrong. He quickly released a handful of talismans with his left hand and threw away the magic artifact with his right hand. He drew a long sword in an attempt to make a final struggle. It was useless. In the face of absolute power, any struggle was futile. The 4 seasons and Zhu Qing entered one after another. It was not clear who came first, who came second, who came first, who came second. But one thing was certain, the 4 seasons had already broken through most of the barriers of the cultivator, and then Zhu Qing arrived, another one-hit kill. There was no difference from the previous first place, but the spectators inside and outside the arena had a different feeling. Kun Dao Jin Dan's face was filled with excitement. She realized that Kun Dao might have really made a mistake, underestimating the strength of Weijian Mountain. Their plan to sacrifice themselves was completely meaningless. If the strength of the 5 swordsmen of Weijian Mountain was like this, what was the suspense of the battle? Senior Yin Yi, the swordsman of your sect is very strong. I have never seen this young man before. Your Weijian Mountain has hidden him really well. Yin Yi smiled bitterly. It was indeed very well hidden on the dome of Wolf's Ridge. The leader of the Sword Union was indeed the leader. His move was indeed extraordinary. Although his cultivation level was not high, his sword skills had completely surpassed the normal level. He was a veteran who had immersed himself in external swords for hundreds of years. His understanding of external swords was not something that a cultivator could compare to. After 2 rounds, he had already confirmed that this small external sword from Xianyuan definitely had a secret on it. Sword spirit. It could not be anything else. He doesn't like to see people. Yes, that person is shy. He could not continue speaking. He could not possibly say that the other 4 swordsmen might not have this kind of ability, right? Wouldn't that be destroying the prestige of Weijian Mountain? Weijian Mountain respected Xianyuan very much, but what they respected was the internal sword, not the external sword. This person was just an accident. It must be shy. Perverted? Kun Dao Jin Dan was speechless. There were countless perverts in the 5-ring continent. There were sword vain, dharma vain, and physique vain. There were all different types of perverts. Like this Fei Chai, he was one of the simpler types. He was bloodthirsty and did not dare to show it in public, so he could only use bright red sugar-coated haws to replace it. Yes, it must be like this. Han Yen was speechless. She was originally happy that her sect had hope of winning the competition and that Boding Ting Island was safe. This was a great thing, but for some reason, she could not be happy. She felt that she was an accomplice because those disgusting sugar-coated haws were personally made by her. She had never thought that such simple sugar-coated haws would have such an effect in a certain environment. Everything was unpredictable. This Fei Chai, ever since she met him, her impression of him had always wavered between good and bad. Every time he surprised her, she did not know what kind of person he was. But there was one thing, he was definitely not a loser. What did it have to do with her? No matter how strong he was, it was impossible for him to defeat all the cultivators of the three pure ones. She would eventually go on stage, eventually. Chapter 367. P.S. Uncle, I'm done for. I'll return the money you gave me back later, as long as you give me enough. The cultivators of the three pure ones sacrificed 2 lives and finally figured out the ins and outs of this sword cultivator. Although the battle was short, some things were still traceable. The first cultivator only activated half of his defense before the swordsman charged at him. Hence, he was killed instantly. This was the difference in strength. Speed, reaction, and response were all problems. It was a normal outcome. The second cultivator's response was standard. He didn't charge at the enemy, but activated his defense first. The other cultivators saw clearly that he activated a total of 7 layers of defense with different attributes. There were talismans, magical items, spells, and physical skills. This was the standard operation of the three pure ones. However, he was still pierced through. This meant that the strength of the Feichai sword was far beyond normal. The reason was unknown. It could be a problem with the flying sword, or it could be due to its potential or some other mysterious force. For example, momentum. Regarding the defense of cultivators, there was their own judgment in the world of cultivation. Generally speaking, a successful defense didn't mean that you had to use all your strength and turn yourself into a turtle shell. In a cultivator's battle philosophy, they would first judge the strength of the opponent's attack, and then, based on this foundation, they would put in some surplus to ensure a safe defensive effect. The purpose of doing this was to leave some mana margin for a counterattack, and not to shrink into a ball and be completely passive. No matter what sect the cultivator was from, a balance between offense and defense was a concept. A pure attack might succeed, but a pure defense would definitely result in a passive situation. It was impossible to not counterattack. No cultivator who didn't know how to fight would do this. Take the strength of the flying sword as an example. The three pure ones, Xianyuan and Weijian Mountain, had been in contact with the external sword for tens of thousands of years. They knew their limits. This wasn't a secret and couldn't be hidden. It was just like how the three pure ones couldn't hide their spells from the swordsman. Assuming that the attack power of the external sword was 10,000 jin, according to the experience of the magic cultivators, as long as he increased his defense by 50%, reaching a defense power of 25,000 jin, there wouldn't be any problems. There wouldn't be any accidents. The remaining magic power reserves would be used for a possible counterattack at any time. In determining whether or not a foundation establishment cultivator was an expert, perfect judgment was very important. If a cultivator could use a defense of 10,000 jin when the opponent's attack was 10,000 jin, then it would be a perfect defense. It meant that you didn't have to use any more magic power, which also meant that you could use more magic power to counterattack. Of course, if you made a wrong judgment, and your defense was broken, then you would reap what you sow and become a joke. It was not easy to be an expert. Accurate judgment, bold and meticulous, and rich experience were not things that everyone could achieve. In view of the first cultivator's defeat, the second cultivator had deliberately added 50% more power to the swordsman's standard flying sword. Yet he was still pierced through. This could only mean that the power of this swordsman's flying sword was not to be underestimated. It had already exceeded the limits of normal judgment. This was the most frightening thing. How much did it exceed the standard by? How many methods did this swordsman know to increase the power of his flying sword? This was the most troublesome thing to think about. This was because he could no longer be understood using normal logic. So, how much should his defense be to be considered safe? At the very least, he had to endure the first attack of his flying sword. If his estimation was too low, he would be in danger. If his estimation was too high, not only would it be a waste of energy, he would also lose the ability to counterattack. How could he hope to win if he was constantly being beaten up? There was also a very important problem. Would the swordsman's second flying sword be as heavy? This was the problem that Lu Xiaoyi created for his opponent. How would you withstand my first attack? This was a problem that every remaining cultivator of the three pure ones had to face. Especially the third cultivator, who was about to go on stage. The host Jin Dan would not give him much time to recover. This was originally a factor that would benefit the three pure ones. But now, he was hoping for more time so that he could think more clearly and thoroughly. If he thought this way, it meant that there was a gap in his Tao heart. It meant that he was mentally unbalanced under the consecutive attacks. This meant that even before the battle began, he was already showing signs of defeat. How would he move after he went out? Left or right? Up or down? The space had already been opened. His opponent was as fast as ever, but he was still thinking about how to defend himself. How to coordinate? Which was the first and which was the last to achieve the best results? His opponent had already passed the center point. He was even more hesitant. Would the barrier be effective? Would using a secret technique to leave in an instant bring trouble to himself? When his opponent was only 3,000 to 4,000 feet away from his starting point, he suddenly realized that it was useless to think about anything. There was no need to think about how to defend himself. Once he went out, he would have to take the sword. Now, it was no longer a question of what to do after going out. It was a question of whether or not to go out. His mentality collapsed. The leader of the three pure ones, Jin Dan, let out a long sigh. With his consciousness, Tai Jin Dan, who was in charge of the space, immediately closed the crack in front of the three pure ones cultivator and announced the result. The three pure ones had lost. Senior! You! Another Jin Dan was a little unwilling to accept this. The leader, Jin Dan, let out a long sigh. I was wrong. The sect was wrong too. An eagle won't come out of seclusion in the sect. No matter how good their deduction methods are, when faced with life and death, they are still trash. Keeping a low profile is a paradox. When I go back, I will advise the sect to chase out all those who keep a low profile and stand aloof from worldly affairs. If you want to keep a low profile, you can change your name. But you must go out and experience the storm. Otherwise, you will be like this one, not even having the courage to stand out. Would the disciples on the ranking be like this? They would have gambled it out long ago. Jin Dan beside him comforted him. Senior, don't worry. This is just an isolated phenomenon. The ones behind shouldn't be like this. They actually have real battle experience, and I thought that we had to investigate this Fei Chai thoroughly. I've never heard of him before. He couldn't have jumped out from a crack in a rock, right? His killing methods are extremely skillful. He must have been around for a long time. Could it be that he used a fake name? On the side of the Kun path, whether it was Jin Dan or the disciples below, they were all cheering. They had been defeated. Could they imagine before the battle? The dignified three pure ones, the pillars of the Dharma cultivators, had been forced to the point where they did not dare to step out of space. Who would believe it if they said it out loud? But it had really happened in front of their eyes. It was so real that it made them feel like they were dreaming. The Jin Dan from the Kun Path's boundary had already completely relaxed. This battle was in the bag. With this Fei Chai's strength, winning one or two more battles was not a problem. He had defeated more than half of the three pure ones with his strength alone. Even if their Kun Path's death warriors could not stop him, there were still 4 Weijian mountain swordsmen. With victory in sight, their mood was good. One of the Kun Path's Jin Dan laughed. Senior, this Fei Chai of yours is interesting. He likes to eat candied haws so much. When he returns, I will provide for him for a lifetime. But I find it strange. A disciple like this from Weijian Mountain should be famous. Another Kun Path's Jin Dan suddenly remembered something. She had always been in charge of nurturing foundation establishment cultivators, so she had a better understanding of the level of foundation establishment, including the ranking. I suddenly remembered. In the last 5-ring foundation establishment ranking, There was once such a person. His name was strange, and his ranking was also strange. He was also a Xianyuan external sword. He was ranked 999th, and his nickname was Candide Hawes. Senior. Chapter 368. Yi was a little embarrassed and coughed dryly. Haha, we have to keep this a secret for now. Among the 5 swordsmen that came from Weijian Mountain, there is indeed a Xianyuan external sword. You guessed right, it's this kid. He is the Candide Haw. The Candide Haw is him. The Fujian Dan wanted to laugh. It was not strange for Xianyuan to intervene. In fact, among the 5 rings, the one with the deepest relationship with the Xianyuan sword sect was not Weijian Mountain, but Xianyuan sword sect. Because the one who established this relationship was the greatest person in the history of Xianyuan. That was Xuanyuan's god. Every time the Xianyuan sword sect was in danger, there was always Xuanyuan's faint support behind them. There was never a lack of support. One of the Jin Dan suddenly thought of something. Xixiang, Fei Chai's habit and name are so strange. If we can all guess it, the 3 pure ones would not have thought of it. What if they say that we pulled in foreign cultivators and do not accept the result this time? Yi smiled proudly. Don't worry. I thought of it long ago. There are many cultivators with 2 sects in the 5 rings. Is it rare? Xuanyuan's external sword is an external sword. Weijian Mountain's external sword is also an external sword. The orthodoxy is the same. Isn't it normal for the East to learn a few moves and the West to steal a few? We have already held an initiation ceremony for him. Therefore, the Candide Haw belongs to our Weijian Mountain. It's just that we used Xuanyuan's identity to mingle in the western regions a few years ago. This, we can check the sect records and have the Weijian Mountain sword talisman as proof. Who dares to say that we broke the rules? Several Kun Dao gold cores could not help but admire the shamelessness of Wei Jianshan. No wonder they only sent 5 sword cultivators. It turned out that they were confident. They did not know that there was indeed an initiation ceremony. However, Weijian Mountain did not know that the Xianyuan external sword they sent this time was so amazing. Yi had already started to make plans in private. This time, he had obtained a talent. He couldn't just foolishly give him back to Xianyuan. In any case, they had many powerful people. With the sharpness of the inner sword and the subjugation of the 5th ring, they wouldn't lack an outer sword, right? How could he think of a way to make Xianyuan fire this brat? The pressure soon fell on the 4th cultivator of the 3 pure ones. His name was Kai Wei. He might not be the strongest among the 9 participants of the 3 pure ones, but he was the most courageous. He didn't care. From his point of view, the swordsman's threat had been magnified. The reason why he had been able to suppress the swordsman until now was probably because he had never been attacked before. What would happen if a swordsman was attacked? Could he still maintain such a heavy sword pressure? How long could he maintain his combat prowess? He had always believed that to measure a cultivator's combat strength, one had to consider both offense and defense, and not just one aspect. This required him to risk his life. Because in this kind of arena space, the use of scapegoat tools was restricted. In the tens of thousands of years of development of the 5th ring, there had been countless similar battles. The funniest one was when a cultivator used 10 or so scapegoat talismans to exhaust his opponent to death. This made the battle even more of a farce. Since then, a trend had arisen in the cultivation world of the 5th ring. They began to reject the use of scapegoat tools that required extremely precious resources, especially in battles. Of course, the storage rings of the disciples of the large sects might contain a few scapegoat talismans. They were used to protect their lives in the wilderness. As soon as the space opened, Kai Wei rushed out without hesitation. He was not in a hurry to set up a defensive barrier. Instead, he took out 3 offensive magic tools, the soul-absorbing golden bell, the headless silver scissors, and the emerald mountain. These were the magic tools he was most proficient in and had refined to the fullest extent. He knew that now was not the time to hide his trump cards. The swordsman's attacks were sharp. If he didn't hide his trump cards now, he would lose his life. He wanted to see how his opponent would react in the face of a mutual explosion. Even if he died in battle, he would still be able to provide an idea for his fellow disciples to fight. His fearlessness made the spectating cultivators gasp in admiration. After all, the three pure ones were one of the top sections. While there might be cowards in the sect, there were also many brave people who took responsibility. The three magic tools were all carefully selected by him. They all had a common characteristic: they could attack from a great distance. Their control range was around 3,000 feet. A cultivator's techniques were limited by distance. This was the case for Foundation Establishment, Jean Dan, and above that, Yuanying and Perfected Monarchs. This would change according to the cultivator's divine sense. In battle, it was a contest of distance control. In this aspect, the swordsman's flying sword was no different from a spell cultivator's magic tool. Because they both had the strength of a Foundation Establishment cultivator's divine sense, there was no need to talk about who would be at a disadvantage in terms of distance. It was a contest of mental strength. Kai Wei's spiritual power was considered strong, and this was also the reason why he dared to take the initiative to attack. The strategy he adopted was to keep the three offensive magic tools far away from him, keeping them 200 feet in front of him. The advantage of this was that as long as his opponent attacked with his sword, he would be able to reach him first. This was a helpless choice, because in terms of flying speed, magic tools were indeed inferior to flying swords. Hence, he could only attack earlier. It was also because of this that controlling three powerful magic tools at a distance of 200 feet was an enormous burden on a cultivator's magic power and soul. He was also very scoundrel. He still did not use a single defensive technique, and only focused all of his attention on attacking. He was staking everything on this one throw. There was no lack of courageous cultivators amongst spell cultivators. Lu Xiaoyi had already noticed this cultivator's movements. His mental strength was stronger than Kai Wei's. He had many ways to deal with this kind of desperate method. However, if he had to find the simplest, most direct, and most shocking method, there was only one. In this round of consecutive victories, he had begun to grasp a hint of the power of intimidation. In the third round, he had directly defeated his opponent. However, to be clearer, he had to be as quick as always. Only then would he be able to experience the true essence of intimidation to the greatest extent. With such an opportunity, why not use it? When the two sides were about 3,000 feet apart, the Four Seasons sword shot out, fully displaying the advantage of speed. At the same time, Kai Wei saw the opportunity. Without changing his mind, the three magic tools increased in power and smashed down. His judgment was very clear. No matter how fast your flying sword is, it has a distance of 3,000 feet. No matter how slow my magic tool is, it has a distance of 1,000 feet. No matter what, I will not fall behind. I want to see how you deal with my magic tools. This was the most exciting moment. It wasn't easy for the two sides to attack each other until now. However, what surprised everyone was that the swordsman who had been charging forward bravely, was actually retreating. Under the pull of the starlight, Lu Xiaoyi's forward charge abruptly turned into a retreat, making it impossible for the three celestial instruments to reach him. This kind of response was incomparably surprising, because if he did this, how could his flying sword achieve anything? Shouldn't you be fighting in close quarters? Now that neither side could hit the other, it looked like a draw on the surface. However, in terms of momentum, the swordsman's momentum was not there. He had lost his drive. Just as Kai Wei had expected, because the distance was too far, the flying sword had lost its last bit of precise control and swept past him a few dozen feet away. This was the worst-case scenario for a sword cultivator. The flying sword had rushed past its head and lost control. Chapter 369. Losing control of the flying sword usually meant that the flying sword was damaged, or too far away to be recalled. Looking at the current situation, it was obvious that the flying sword had lost its distance. The reason was simple. The cultivator's relentless attack forced the swordsman to retreat, causing him to forget to control his flying sword that was already flying too fast. At that moment, everyone seemed to have seen the swordsman's fatal weakness. Oh, so other than the heavy weight of his first sword, he was actually just an inexperienced mid-stage swordsman? In the next moment, the swordsman disappeared. When he reappeared, he was only 10 feet away from Kai Wei. The sword in his hand was like the scythe of the Grim Reaper. Heaven measuring sword ruler. In the intense earlier stages of the competition, in the first 3 rounds, everyone had forgotten that the swordsman had a habit of using close-range combat. His inner sword had the shadow sword, while his outer sword had the heaven-measuring sword ruler. Especially when his flying sword had already flown past his opponent, it was theoretically possible for him to close in on his opponent in an instant. If that was the case, all of this could be the swordsman's sudden inspiration, but it could also be a deliberate death trap. The moment the swordsman closed in on him, Jin Dan of the 3 Pure Ones did not hesitate to send a message to Tai Jin Dan. Lu Xiaoyi's sword strike missed its target. His opponent had been moved to another place by some mysterious force. He licked his lips. Damn, it's been 2 rounds since he last ate Tonghalu. This disgusting action sent chills down the spines of the spectators. This person was really perverted. There was no blood, no killing. Just look at his unsatisfied face. Actually, Lu Xiaoyi did not have to get close to his opponent. His flying sword was controlled by the sword's spirit. In terms of range, it was an unbeatable killer. However, considering that there were still 5 cultivators of the 3 Pure Ones behind him, he had to keep some tricks up his sleeve. That was why he chose to get close to his opponent. It was a perfect response. Who asked his opponent to place his magic weapons so far away? If he didn't get close to him, who would? Just as the climax was about to arrive, it was doused with cold water. Who would be willing to do that? The audience booed loudly. However, Jin Dan of the 3 Pure Ones was extremely thick-skinned and acted as if he had not heard anything. Cultivators like Kai Wei were exactly what the 3 Pure Ones lacked. Of course they had to save him. It was much more valuable than saving the 3rd cultivator. He had already shown his courage, and the only thing left to do was to fight with the swordsman within a few dozen feet. He would definitely be chopped into pieces. The cultivators outside all had different moods. But the 2 sides that remained inside the space could be said to be half ice water and half fire. On the side of Kuandao and Weijian Mountain, the 4 Kuandao cultivators were still fine. They could already faintly see victory and hope for survival. Therefore, there was joy in the silence, and a trace of nervousness in the longing. But in the ears of the host, Tai Jin Dan, it was filled with unbearable curses. They were all from the other 4 swordsmen of Weijian Mountain. Donkey Ball Fei Chai! Everyone sweeps the snow in front of their own door. You've already cleaned your own house, so why bother sweeping the widow's house next door? To your ancestors. Even if you want to eat alone, you can't eat it all in one go, right? At least leave 2 for the grandpas. Idiot! I even treated you to meat and wine, and this is how you repay me? A foundation establishment cultivator came to the front of several Jin Dan and reported in a low voice. The matter is clear. This Fei Chai is not the real Fei Chai. It's Sword Smoke Stub Lu Xiaoyi outside of Xianyuan. His nickname is Sugar-Coated Haws. This is the person who sneaked into Weijian Mountain's team to cause trouble here. He was once in the last 5-ring ranking and was ranked 999th. But for some reason, he wasn't selected this time. But I heard from friends who are familiar with the situation in the western regions that this person appeared 2 years ago in Jialan's 800 vying barges. He killed those elites and almost killed a few people. The few Golden Core cultivators shook their heads as they listened. This person was really trash. Listen to his name. In Xianyuan, he was called Cigarette Stub; in Weijian Mountain, he was called Sugar-Coated Hawes. None of them were normal. The leader of the Jin Dan made a prompt decision. "I mean, stop the battle!" Another Jin Dan hesitated. "If we stop, no matter the reason, the three pure ones will be judged to have lost this time." The leader of the Jin Dan insisted. "The outcome has already been decided. Junior brothers, are you still holding on to unrealistic fantasies? The three pure ones have been passed down for so long, and the biggest advantage is that we will retreat when we need to. We will never stubbornly hold on for the sake of face. This person is strong among the Foundation establishment cultivators. Without looking at his cultivation, he is ranked in the top 10. Up to now, he hasn't shown any real ability. Our disciples have secret techniques. Does he not have any? In 4 battles, this person has consumed very little energy. Conservatively speaking, he can win at least 2 more battles. At that time, how many of us will be left? Is there anyone among our disciples who can turn the situation around? Not to mention, if this person really defeats our 3 pure ones, we will lose a lot of face. Why don't we make use of the fact that he is a disciple of Xian Yuan and publicly announce that Weijian Mountain is cheating?" Not only can we avoid casualties, but we can also dilute the outcome. We can also make another bet with Kun Dao afterward. Why not? As expected of the Jin Dan realm, he had thought through the reasons. The other 2 Jin Dan of the 3 pure ones agreed. After making the decision, they immediately passed the message to Daoist Tai, who was in charge of the space. Lu Xiaoyi felt the space loosening and knew that the 5th battle had begun. He was squeezing forward, but he didn't expect the space to suddenly close. His face was almost flattened. The next moment, the restrictions around him disappeared. The blue sky above his head and the green water below his feet. Besides a few female Kun Dao cultivators who were crying tears of joy, there were also 4 pairs of fierce eyes staring at him and slowly gathering towards him. Lu Xiaoyi was a little confused. This is the half-time break? It's time to eat. Those 3 pure ones cultivators who were unwilling to accept this also cast their gazes over. It was unforgettable. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. How could this be? Just like Wushang, he was like this in Wolf's Ridge. Perhaps it was also the tradition of the Dharma lineage, killing with one's eyes. He was a little regretful. Because he had lost his opponent, he had no chance to break through his domineering aura. The 3 pure ones reacted quickly and correctly. If he didn't consider his reputation, this was the best choice at the moment. He really wanted to clear all 9 of them. This battle space was very advantageous to him, including the rules. If it wasn't here, his battle would be much more difficult. Whether it was the hostility of the 3 pure ones cultivators, the admiration of the swordsmen of Weijian Mountain, or the gratitude in the eyes of the Kun Dao cultivators, at least from now on, Lu Xiaoyi's name would gradually rise in the 5-ring continent. There would no longer be any reason to bury him, and no one would look down on him. At least in the circle of Foundation establishment, he had successfully turned from a small pawn into a big devil. And this was not what he wanted. At least, he felt that it was still too early. Chapter 370. The 3 pure ones, Kun Daoli realm, and Weijian Mountain's Jin Dan gathered together and quarreled fiercely. Beside them was a group of mediators led by Tai. In the quarrel, Yi proudly took out the evidence that he had prepared long ago. The 3 pure ones would definitely suffer this loss. The spectators who came from afar to watch the battle were also dissatisfied. They thought that it would be a sumptuous meal, but in the end, it turned out to be a roadside snack. The worst thing was that a group of urban management officers rushed out halfway through the meal. It was really not satisfying. They would not complain about the 3 pure ones, nor would they complain about Kun Dao and Xian Yuan. They would not let go of Weijian Mountain, saying that there was a problem with their arrangement, and that they had reversed the vanguard and the champion. There was a lot of noise, some were happy, some were worried, and some were not afraid of making things worse. The three pure ones rejected Kun Daoli Realm's invitation to stay and left Fan Ting Island on the same day. No matter how thick-skinned they were, it was still human skin and there was always a limit. Weijian Mountain did not leave, so there was no need to be in such a hurry. The key was that Yi still wanted to use Kun Daoli Realm to make Xianyuan look bad and poach him. He did not have much time, so he had to get it done before Xianyuan understood. Otherwise, once the news here spread, the corner would become cast iron, and it would be useless no matter how hard he tried. For this battle, although Xianyuan was far away, he was also involved. He sent Lu Xiao to announce his attitude. Of course, Xianyuan did not expect that the swordsmen he sent would have such strength, otherwise they would have told Weijian Mountain to strengthen the control and protection. Yi knew this reason, which was why he had this idea. He had a very high position in the Weijian Mountain Gold Corps, otherwise he would not have been sent here alone. He had a certain amount of authority to make decisions. Moreover, he was even more clear that if this matter was reported, the sect would definitely support it. They could only use their power from behind and would definitely not stop it. Senior brother, why are you in such a hurry? It's just a letter of safety, that's all. But that's right. We still have to thank Xianyuan for helping us by sending such an outstanding disciple. So I'll write a letter of praise and send it over by secret transmission. Jin Dan, the leader of the swordsman sect, whose name was Yu Ping, said with a smile. However, he did not know that this seemingly upright senior brother swordsman was actually full of evil tricks. Yi laughed dryly. No need, no need. I've already written the letter. All you need to do is leave a seal, engrave a certificate, and use your teleportation channel. He thought about it carefully. He couldn't do it himself. Xianyuan would guard against him. But Xianyuan would not guard against the Kun Daoli realm. Yu Ping stretched out her hand. The sun has really risen from the west. Even someone like senior apprentice brother would be so meticulous. Fine, give it to me. I'll upload it to senior apprentice brother. Yi put on an amiable smile. No need to trouble junior marshal sister. Junior marshal sister only needs to lead me there, and I will pass it myself. Yu Ping also smiled amiably. Senior apprentice brother, your skill of deceiving people is too bad, isn't it? We've known each other for hundreds of years. Do you think I don't know you? Give me the letter. I'd like to see what's written on it. If there's someone who smears my Kun Dao, I won't forgive you. Yi was helpless. He was under the eaves, so he had to lower his head. In other people's territory, it was impossible for him to send a letter with an unknown purpose. So he could only hand it over and apologize. Junior Marshal Sister, look at the situation in Irai. There's a lot of pressure. Therefore, the competition for disciples is fierce. Since we are all from Irai, why don't you just turn a blind eye to it? Xianyuan is a rich man. He has a lot of money, so he doesn't care about these trivial things. With a sweep of his divine sense, Yiny's nonsense was clear. The first part was nonsense, so he did not mention it. This battle was an example of joint interaction under the covenant. It fully demonstrated the friendly spirit of understanding, tolerance, and mutual assistance. The cultivators of the three sects cooperated sincerely, and each had their own performance. They learned from each other's strengths to make up for their weaknesses. This was a victory of cooperation, a victory of unity. Every sect and every person played an irreplaceable role in it. However, there were also imperfections under the jewel. After the sun, there were shadows. In some aspects, this battle also showed the lack of morals of some cultivators. For example, Lan Chong of Weijian Mountain and Xuanyuan's cigarette butt. They did not care about cooperation, were unwilling to share, and were greedy for credit. There were even some who were disharmonious and bullied the weak. They thought that they had contributed to Dinghai, so they flirted with Kun cultivators, spouted nonsense, and had bad intentions. Lan Chong flirted with Xiao Jian first and cigarette but was the last. It was very shameful and damaged the reputation of Sword Vane. It was also detrimental to the unity of the alliance. In view of this, Weijian Mountain has opened Lan Chong for 3 years to serve as a warning to others and observe the consequences. This notice is not for punishment but for the truth and mutual trust. Here, we shall be friends forever, forever and ever. Yu Ping was amused and exasperated at the same time. Senior brother Yin Yi, who looked righteous and selfless, was really a mess. He was shrouded in fog and did not tell the truth. He was full of lies, but when you thought about it, it did not seem to be completely groundless. Cigarette but was Fei Chai. He took on 4 cultivators alone and forced the 3 pure ones to retreat. However, he said that he did not know how to cooperate and take all the credit for himself. It did not seem to be a complete lie. Lan Chong to Xiao Jian and Cigarette, but to Han Yan were just Kun Dao Li Jia was afraid that they would be unfamiliar with Fang Ting. They sent cultivators to receive them to interact and get to know each other in the future. Did they have bad intentions? The funniest thing was that in order to make it look real, Yin Yi even dragged in the innocent Lan Chong and accused him of something he didn't do. His real intention was, you see, I, Wei Jianshan, am impartial. As a big brother, shouldn't you set an example? The most detailed thing was the severity of the punishment. It was not a serious crime like killing one's master. Of course, Xian Yuan would not expel a swordsman from the sect forever. Therefore, Weijian Mountain decided to expel him for 3 years to observe the consequences. What a clever move! If Xian Yuan did not check, he would also expel him for 3 years. He would probably lose this cultivator immediately, and would not have the chance to observe the consequences. Yin Yi knew that these little tricks could not fool the observant people. He smiled apologetically, which was rare. Sister Yu Ping! We've known each other for hundreds of years. I've never asked you for anything, have I? This is the first time. You can't disappoint your brother. Yu Ping was speechless. This guy was already so old, but he still dared to say brother and sister. How shameless! Senior martial brother! To achieve your goal, you dragged the innocent Lan Chong into this. Doesn't it hurt you to do this? Yin Yi chuckled. He's my disciple. If he dares to fart, I'll slap him. Yu Ping dared not promise him. It was impossible. She was about to reject him when her martial uncle's voice rang in her ears. Let him be. For thousands of years, Weijian Mountain has never taken advantage of Xian Yuan. It's the same this time. Yu Ping sighed and pretended to be troubled. All right, we're close. But this won't happen again. Chapter 371. Lu Xiaoyi was treated like a hero on Boding Ting Island, which made him feel uncomfortable all over. He knew the importance of double standards. When others treated him like a hero, he was not far from death. Therefore, the only thing that could help him was to defile himself. How could he defile himself in a place like Boding Ting Island, which was full of women? It definitely wasn't a fight. His behavior automatically began to move in the direction that Taoist Yin Yi had described. It was also hard to predict the fate of the underworld. Go ahead and shout. Even if you shout to the heavens, no one will come to save you. A pretty maid was forced into a corner by him, trembling. Lu Xiaoyi grinned and stretched out his evil hand. A sigh came from behind him. Fei Chai, I really want to know, if I didn't stop you this time, would you really have done it? Lu Xiaoyi didn't even turn his head and continued to press. You can try. If you pity her so much, why don't you take her place? Han Yan's figure flashed, and she threw the maid out of the room. She stood in front of Lu Xiaoyi, standing there with her breasts slightly puffed out and her eyes clear. I definitely won't resist. I'm just waiting for you to show your evil side. I want to see to what extent you can pretend. Lu Xiaoyi continued to stretch out his hand until his fingers were about to touch Han Yan's sensitive area. Finally, he stopped and complained. Han Yan! What are you doing here? Every time I'm about to succeed, I meet you. In any case, our relationship is not bad. Don't force me. Han Yan laughed. If you really want to do something bad, it won't be like this. At least I can feel that when you do something bad, you always choose a time when others will come in and see you. Moreover, you've never succeeded. With your ability to defeat 4 cultivators of the 3 pure ones in a row, how can you be so stupid in other directions? Why are you doing this? Lu Xiaoyi had no choice but to give up. Call me Xiaoyi. What cigarette but Fei Chai Tonghalu? It's too unpleasant to hear. Han Yan smiled and sat down beside him. She had her own unique ability to distinguish a person's true intentions. Therefore, his facade was simply unable to deceive her. In fact, it was not only her, there were many other sisters who also had a woman's talent in this aspect. They were able to see through his little trick with a single glance. He was still too inexperienced to pretend to be a bad guy. Why should it be like this? Everyone is envious of you. I'm envious of your excellent swordsmanship, young hero, but you don't seem too happy? Lu Xiaoyi sighed. You don't know. This kind of envy was the poison behind it. Everyone had their own troubles. When they were weak, they had their own troubles. When their strength rose, they had their own troubles. There was no end to it. Everyone is praising me. Your Kun Daoli realm, those bastards from Wei Sword Mountain, and even your opponent, the 3 pure ones. They even spread rumors that I have the ability to enter the top 10 of 5-ring foundation establishment cultivators. This was overpraising. After this battle, those who challenge me in the future will no longer be nobodies, but the true experts at the forefront. He would stop at nothing and no longer care about the rules. The key point is that I still don't have the ability to ignore others. You let a wolf mingle with a group of tigers, isn't this just making things difficult for others? Han Yan finally understood a little. Her strength was far from reaching Lu Xiaoyi's level, so she was unable to imagine his troubles. Every family had their own problems. But what does this have to do with you always finding opportunities to defame yourself? Is there any necessary connection between strength and character? If you were a powerhouse with a bad record, wouldn't others find more reasons to attack you? Since Lu Xiaoyi had said this, he did not want to hide it. He had a special feeling towards this Han Yan. That kind of pure and untainted impression was not only on the outside, but also on the inside. This was a very special feeling, like 2 special souls, a special recognition between each other. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. At this point, what happens outside is already out of control. What I want to control is the trouble within the sect. The stronger you are, the greater the responsibility. Simply speaking, there will be endless missions to find you, making you unable to rest for even a moment. Whether you are willing or not. The trouble outside can be avoided, but the trouble from the sect cannot be avoided. Just like this time when I came to Fonting Island, frankly speaking, I did not want to come. Han Yan finally understood. In this young swordsman's heart, he had not truly accepted becoming a true swordsman. A ruthless swordsman who would always use the harshest training to temper himself, always use the most difficult missions to temper himself. Just like those lunatics in Weijian Mountain. This was not strange, not every swordsman had a sword heart, and not every Taoist had a Tao heart. Just like herself, what Tao heart did she have? The heart needed to be tempered. Realm, knowledge, experience, changes, setbacks, blows, and even death. Every cultivator would fumble their way forward on this path, but how many of them would dare to say that they had a heart for cultivation? At the very least, this young swordsman had the means of a swordsman even before he had a true sword heart. She did not know how he managed to cultivate it. Just from this point alone, he was stronger than the majority of cultivators in the same realm. A wave of sympathy welled up in Han Yan's heart. This was a cultivator whose strength far surpassed his mentality. In the understanding of cultivators, this kind of disharmony could easily lead to chi deviation. If he deviated from the normal path, then... Little E, can you tell me why you eat sugar-coated haws after killing people? This habit is not good, others will see you as a pervert. Is there a reason? Or is it just a habit? Do you like blood? Do you like red? Lu Xiaoyu was very embarrassed. To tell the truth, he did not want to explain this matter to others. They did not believe him, including his closest friends Yan Bo and Yan Heng. But under the clear eyes of this woman in front of him, he did not want to lie. At the same time, he warned himself that this was the last time he would reveal the truth to others. I faint from blood. They don't believe it. I've fainted since I was young. After I started cultivating, it got better, but it was not completely eradicated. Eating sugar-coated haws can help me recover quickly. You know, in frequent battles, even a moment of absent-mindedness can bring danger to my life. I don't want others to find out my secret, so... Han Yan's smile was like a spring flower. She could feel that Lu Xiaoyu was speaking the truth. She was very happy that he was willing to tell her his biggest secret. She would also keep this secret forever. But this secret was still so laughable. It made this sword cultivator who killed people without batting an eyelid in the eyes of outsiders become so real, so cute, making people feel pity for him. She took Lu Xiaoyu's hand and walked into the room. Little E, blood is not scary. Some blood represents slaughter, so you don't want to look at it directly. But some blood represents a new life. For example, every child's mother's blood when they first come to this world. I can't make you understand this kind of life blood, but I can show you another kind of blood, a kind of blood when a young girl becomes a woman. When you understand its meaning, you will know that it is only a very simple psychological barrier. Chapter 372. P.S. Gathering together. Bullying an old man. Using bean buns instead of rations. At the top of the dome, in a side hall of the Sword Aura Court, more than 10 Jin Dan sat together. They were holding a monthly meeting of the Xianyuan External Sword, which was hosted by a few Jin Dan members of the Sword Aura Court. The participants came from all the peaks and halls of the External Sword, such as the Arrival Hall, the External Hall, the Dark Hall, the Ming Hall, the Boa Tower, the Sword Enshrining Tower, the Equipment Sect Tower, the Pill House, etc. Lu Xiaoyu knew a few familiar faces: Gu Gang, Gu Shan, Gu Lin. This was a habit of the External Sword, and it had been so for tens of thousands of years. After all, they had to manage 20,000 Foundation establishment cultivators, and there was a lot of work to be done. They had to coordinate the distribution of resources and the distribution of rewards, and they had to be fair and just. They had to coordinate the assignment of tasks, and they could not be too biased. They had to plan the cultivation of disciples, the lectures for the assembly, and so on. They also had to communicate the internal harmony of the entire external sword system, and limit the differences and conflicts within a reasonable range. Therefore, the monthly Jin Dan meeting was very important. Everyone would make judgments and decisions on important matters, including the punishment of disciples. Punishment, like rewards, was an important method that could not be ignored. Xianyuan did not have many punishments, and most of them were grounding or completing difficult tasks. However, there were many who were expelled, and there were at least 8 or 10 of them every year. There were many reasons, and there were always bad habits that were hard to change. Most of them were due to accidental injuries in battle, which caused irreversible mistakes. For example, this time, a Jin Dan member of the Sword Aura Court frowned. Cigarette butt? Who knows this person? What's the situation? Why did the message that Kun Dao sent us have such a bad impression of this person? Greedy for merit? This is pardonable. Disunity? This is a big problem. Regardless of whether it is Wei Sword Mountain or Kun Dao Li Jia, they are Xuanyuan's most important allies in the Fifth Ring. Every swordsman has been reminded countless times to cooperate with each other, and never put on the airs of a top sect. This is a problem of attitude. Harassing a Kun Dao female cultivator? Improper? This? Who knows if it is improper or not? Is it intention? Or is it real? The other disciple, Jin Dan, had an extremely displeased expression on his face. His name was Gu Dong, and just like his name, he was an upright person who did things in an old-fashioned manner. He used the standards of an ancient swordsman to judge his disciples. On the Thousand Elegance Peak, he was the martial uncle that everyone feared. In his hands, he would always punish those who offended him severely. When we cultivate, we observe with our hearts. Do we need to determine the truth of what is going on? Since Kun Dao Li Realm had sent such a message, it meant that the other party had a certain attitude. Kun Dao Li Realm rarely did this, but since it did, it must be intolerable. In my opinion, we should not be tolerated and should be severely punished. Weijian Mountain is willing to expel their own disciples from the sect for 3 years to see what happens. I, Xianyuan, am the righteous leader of the sect. Of course, I cannot lose my sense of righteousness over these small matters. Gu Dong's words were true and held the moral high ground. No one could refute them. However, Xianyuan had always been cautious when it came to expelling their own disciples. It was not something that could be swayed by a few words from an old antique. The other Jin Dan hesitated. He knew that his information might be unfavorable to this disciple, but he could not hide it due to his principles of fairness. Just now, Weijian Mountain sent a message saying that the cigarette butt was indeed improper. The evidence is conclusive. Humph! Gu Dong harumphed hatefully, showing his dissatisfaction towards these fellow disciples who were always trying to protect their own. He did not even need to guess to know what these people were thinking. What was the big deal about taking advantage of others? Xianyuan's swordsman going out to take advantage of others was a matter of course. No matter which aspect it was. As expected, Gu Lin coughed lightly and said, "Well, let me interrupt. This could also be a mutual consent, a mutual affinity. Who knows, maybe the tortoise saw the mung bean and they fell in love." Gu Dong was furious. In just a few days they fell in love? Has this tortoise never seen the mung bean before? Gu Lin sternly said. "Senior brother, you're wrong. You've been alone all your life. You've never married a wife or a Dao companion. Maybe in this aspect you're a little unfamiliar? We swordsmen have always been clean and efficient. Once our swords are drawn, we have no regrets. In this aspect, how could we be like mortals? How could we need to spend countless time together, break in, and test each other? Rich and poor, noble and lowly, high and low, how could these worldly matters be placed in the eyes of cultivators? This life's fate is cultivated in 3 lifetimes. Isn't it just a matter of a glance? A second glance is superfluous. That's a hua from next door." Gu Shan also said, "Senior brother, that woman is also a foundation establishment cultivator. She's not a chi-eater, and she's definitely not a mortal. If you say that I, a Xianyuan swordsman, use force to kill her, I'll believe it. If you say that I use force to do that, I won't believe it. It's obvious that the two of them fell in love with each other." Who doesn't know that Botingting Island is a place filled with mung beans? It's completely normal for them to fall in love. The palace masters under them had been in contact with the foundation establishment disciples for a long time, so they all had feelings for them. They wouldn't lightly punish them unless they committed a heinous crime. However, Jin Dan, who came from the Soaring Heaven Pavilion, was detached from the masses. They usually didn't come in contact with the foundation establishment disciples. They were aloof, so they were used to strictly enforcing the rules. As a result, they were divided into 2 factions, unable to come to an agreement. No one was willing to yield. This was the good thing about being in the cultivation world. Everyone relied on their own ability to climb up. No one was inferior to anyone, so there was no need to flatter anyone. Unless your realm was higher than mine, don't even think about making me shut up. It seemed that they couldn't come to a conclusion. The Soaring Heaven Pavilion had more authority, and the various palace halls had more people. They were evenly matched. Gu Gang, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke up. He had come on behalf of Palace Master Gu He. Originally, he didn't want to get involved in these official squabbles, but since it was related to a disciple he was familiar with, he couldn't just sit by and watch. Once he opened his mouth, It represented the attitude of the Ascension Palace. This was the main palace hall that managed the Foundation establishment disciples. Its weight wasn't light. Arguing back and forth without even figuring out the truth, it'll be a joke if it gets out. My intention is to directly send a message to the Kuan Daoli realm and ask for the details before deciding how to deal with it. The continuous transmission of information required resources. Moreover, if it was used frequently, it would be very easy for their opponents, such as the Supreme Sect and the Three Pure Ones, to find out about their contact method. When the time came, they would have the opportunity to give you a deadly fake news, which would cause problems. Therefore, unless there was an important matter, they would generally not use it. After a period of time, they would even change the contact method as a precaution. The current set of contact keys had already been used for nearly 100 years. According to the agreement of both sides, it would be changed after 100 years. In any case, it was going to be changed, so it didn't matter how many times it was used. This was where Gu Gang's intention lay. No one thought of this detail, but they felt that it was very reasonable. This Ascension Palace Vice Palace Master was very experienced and meticulous in handling matters, so they all agreed. Very quickly, the Kuan Daoli realm sent back a message. Gu Gang, as the operator, picked up the letter so that everyone could read it with their divine sense. Chapter 373. P.S. Let the old man catch his breath, he's already been hollowed out. Gu Gang's tone was calm, as if he was talking about something that had nothing to do with him. There are a few key points, please pay attention to them. The reason why Cigarette But was seen as not being united was because he single-handedly cut off the thoughts of the Three Pure Ones. He killed 2 people and defeated 2 people. The Three Pure Ones were unwilling to continue the bet that they were bound to lose, so they stopped the bet with the reason that Cigarette But was a disciple of Xianyuan. However, the Three Pure Ones' plan did not succeed because Weijian Mountain prepared a ceremony for Cigarette But to enter Weijian Mountain in advance. In the 3 families of Sword Vein, this situation is very common. When Weijian Mountain disciples come to the western regions for missions, many of them will enter the sect before I enter the hall. In other words, if we expel Cigarette But from Xianyuan, he will only have one identity left, a disciple of Weijian Mountain. There's another point. The first report of Kuan Dao was actually written by Weijian Mountain. Everyone stared at each other. They were all human. Once the letter was written, who didn't know what was going on? With this premise, in fact, the so-called rumors about the Kuan Dao cultivators were dispelled. As for the disciple of Weijian Mountain, needless to say, it was also a smokescreen to seduce Xianyuan. Gudong's face was red. He was slapped in the face. Weijian Mountain is a group of scum. Who's the leader? These few reports did not mention who was the leader of the Weijian Mountain group, but the news before the battle mentioned it. Ajin Dan chuckled. Senior brother Gudong, it's your old friend, Yin Yi. He knows you very well. He knows that if he says this, you will definitely jump out and advocate for the expulsion of disciples. Then, Xuanyuan's talents will become Weijian Mountains. If the martial uncles know about this, I'm afraid you can only go to Zhonglao Peak to grow vegetables. Gudong was flustered and exasperated. He and Yin Yi had known each other for a lifetime and had fought together many times. He did not expect that when he was old, he would almost be buried by his old friend. When I see that bastard, I'll chop off his dog head. Everyone laughed. It was just a joke. If they really fought, Gudong would not be Yin Ye's opponent. From the perspective of an external sword, they were very clear about Wei Jianshan's strength. It was not something they could compare to. Therefore, those golden core cultivators who did not recognize the cigarette but were very curious. When did a tiger appear in their backyard? The tiger was currently touring Tinghai with someone else. He had unexpectedly caught the eye of a beauty and was very pleased with himself. He didn't know if he was still dizzy at the sight of blood. He needed to prove it, but now was obviously not the time to prove it. In 3 days, the two of them toured all the famous and unknown beautiful scenery around Tihai Island. For someone like him who liked to be close to nature, he was greatly satisfied, whether it was from a psychological or physical point of view. He also didn't know how he ended up together with Han Yen. If it was someone else, like those beauties he met at the dome, he would definitely refuse, because it wasn't troublesome enough. If it was his senior apprentice sister, well, maybe he would think about it. But on Fanting Island, in this beautiful paradise on Earth, with such a clean and spotless girl like Han Yen together, he didn't even have the thought of refusing. Just like when he first saw her, he felt that they were the same kind of people. Now, if the two of them read their names together, one word could be omitted. Han Yen Yi. He was now considering whether he should put most of his energy and time in Irai. There was also a sword vein here, and he also had a close Taoist companion. This kind of life was a combination of work and rest. It was much better than cultivating bitterly. Tomorrow, they would leave Weijian Mountain, but he wanted to stay for a while longer. Now that they were in a difficult situation, how could they leave just like that? The two of them flew to a big rock by the sea and Han Yen landed. The two of them stood side by side. The woman was as beautiful as a fairy, and the man was as handsome as a tree in the wind. Well, even if he was not as handsome as a tree in the wind, he was probably a pine tree in the wind. This place is called Wanfu Rock. It is a legend among mortals because the sea is their natural moat. But it is the same for cultivators. In the world of cultivators, there are more such natural moats, and they are even more difficult to cross. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. So profound. So reasonable. When I am with you, I feel that my level has been raised. Han Yen rolled her eyes at him. That is in your eyes. In the eyes of all the cultivators of Kun Dao, it is my level that has been raised. Little Yi, come sit down. I have something to say. Lu Xiaoyi was somewhat confused. He had a premonition that this might be a very important matter, but he had no clue at all. Han Yen looked at the obedient Lu Xiaoyi and sighed in her heart. Who would have thought that the bloodthirsty demon who had slaughtered everyone in the arena with the 3 pure ones was actually such a quiet big child in private? The relationship between men and women between cultivators was basically divided into 2 types. One type was commonly known as Dao companions. Under the strict scrutiny of both parties like merchants, they would put each of their own things on a scale to weigh, calculate, and evaluate, in order to find every trace of something that might be useful to them for many years to come. Dao companions, Dao first, then companions. Looking for companions was for Dao, this was the principle. It had nothing to do with feelings. The other type only needed a glance. They did not need to consider family, wealth, status, strength, sect, future. Just a glance, relying on the intuition that cultivators gradually formed in their cultivation. To the two of them, their different origins made them trust their intuition even more. This was the reason why Han Yen saw Lu Xiaoyi among the 5 swordsmen of Weijian Mountain at a glance, and Lu Xiaoyi also saw Han Yen among the 8 flower-like beauties at a glance. This was a mysterious attraction that came from their previous lives. There was no need to say much, and there was also no need for long contact. They could be Dao companions, and they could also be lifelong friends. These were not important. What was important was that they knew that maintaining each other's hearts was the most important. But Han Yen knew that it should end here. In terms of temperament, she was more mature than Lu Xiaoyi. This was also a woman's characteristic. Therefore, she should be the one to end it. At the very least, it should be a temporary end. The two of them had too long a path to walk, too many experiences to go through. The result of helping each other was that one of them would definitely fall behind in the end. Because of concern, they would lose their original perseverance. This was impossible for the first type of Dao companions to exist, because they were not true companions. Concern was a good thing, and maintaining assistance would allow them to get through the current crisis. Unfortunately, they could never achieve a balance. In the end, one person could only become the other's protector, and the other person could become the other's pet. This was not the eternity that true cultivators pursued. What a true cultivator pursued was a beautiful memory. They let the memories slowly ferment in their memories, becoming mellow and rich, with endless aftertastes. They were both too young, and being young made it easy for people to make mistakes. It was easy for them to see the present as eternity. It was impossible to say who took the initiative and who was passive. Both of them were completely willing. But since she was the one who started it on the surface, then she should also be the one to end it. It was a good beginning and a good ending. Taoists paid particular attention to this. Chapter 374. Starting tomorrow, I'm going into seclusion. Otherwise, if this continues, I'll be left behind by you. Han Yen played it down. There were some things that didn't need to be said clearly. Little Yi wasn't that stupid. However, what she didn't know was that she was very clear about her past, but this man knew nothing about his. Lu Xiaoyi naturally understood. He was indeed very inexperienced in some aspects, but he was also very experienced in others. Saying this at this time, on the eve of Weijian Mountain's departure, meant something. He wasn't surprised, because he knew this woman was unusual. He looked forward to getting along with her for a while, but he didn't expect this time to be so short. He knew that separation was good for everyone's cultivation. An eagle that just learned how to fly shouldn't have a nest to tie them down. There were many things that could be proven with time. Separation wasn't the goal, but a better reunion in the future. He understood, but some gentleness could wear down a person's will. He gently stroked her long hair. We have to set a date for our next meeting, right? He didn't say that he would come to Boating Ting Island to see her. They needed to respect each other. This was a tacit understanding between cultivators. From the day they stepped into cultivation, they were no longer mortals. The love between mortals no longer belonged to them. Men and women who cultivated didn't pursue day and night. What they pursued was that when one of them took a step forward, the other could also follow. They didn't want to drag each other down. Han Yen thought about it. Regarding Lu Xiaoyi, although they had only known each other for less than 10 days, she was very clear that this person's biggest problem was laziness. If no one urged him, he would continue to be lazy and undisciplined, not seeking to improve himself. Then, let's meet in Jindan? We'll meet in Jindan. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. That's not fair. Han Yen was already in the late stage of foundation establishment, one step away from the peak stage. However, he was in the middle stage of foundation establishment, one step away from the late stage. The gap between them wasn't small. He knew this woman was spurring him on, but he preferred to be free and unrestrained. She pulled Lu Xiaoyi's hand over and put it on her chest. Listen! It's telling you, don't put yourself in danger. Don't think that you can look down on the heroes of the world just because you're strong. Don't think that just because you're from Xianyuan, everyone will spoil you. If something happens to you, I won't be able to save you. Similarly, if something happens to me, you will also be dragged into the whirlpool. Don't let us become a burden to the other. I can do it, what about you? Lu Xiaoyi also pulled her hand over and placed it on his heart. I can do it too. In the future, my experiences might be more exciting than yours. If you hear that I'm in some kind of desperate situation, don't worry. Don't reach out and wait patiently. That might just be a trap that I've dug for others. Han Yen sighed. You have already dug a hole for me. The next day, Lu Xiaoyi didn't bid farewell and Han Yen didn't come to send them off. Just like this, the group of people from Weijian Mountain boarded Taoist Yinye's flying boat and set off for Weijian Mountain. Lan Cheng, one of the swordsmen from Weijian Mountain, was very curious. Xiaoyi, why didn't you stay on Fanting Island? Or bring that girl to Weijian Mountain too? Lu Xiaoyi snorted. If you like to eat chicken dumplings, why would you bring an old hen with you? Or live in a chicken coop? Weijian Mountain? Is that a place for people to live? Other than swords, there's nothing. Yin Yi, who was steering the boat, nodded to himself. He was a Xianyuan descendant indeed. Not only did he pull up his pants, but he also refused to admit it. Very well. Lu Xiaoyi looked down on Weijian mountain scenery. Everyone was attacking, but there was one person who remained silent. Lu Xiaoyi found it strange. Senior brother Lan Chong, what's wrong with you? Are you missing Xiao Jian as soon as you left Fangting Island? Lan Chong was frustrated. Miss my foot. I didn't even have a bite of meat. Thanks to you, I was kicked out of the sect for 3 years. The teleportation formation was only available in Weijian Mountain. Kun Daoli did not have one. It was not a matter of setting it up but other considerations. From the perspective of safety, Fa Ting Island did not have the ability to withstand a wave of attacks from the top forces. Setting up a formation on the island would make Kun Dao more conspicuous and become a thorn in the side of martial cultivators. After all, the core of their alliance was Sword Alliance. Therefore, the teleportation formation of the core was only available in the three-sword vein. Weijian Mountain was a place that was even more ruthless than Xianyuan. It was so ruthless that it was unreasonable. It was the wildest of the 3 core forces of Sword Alliance. Xianyuan Sword Sect was more magnanimous and reasonable due to their strength and status. They had the elites of Inner Sword and the cannon fodder of Outer Sword. It was a rather balanced system. Firmament Sword Sect was more low-key. As a sect that purely relied on Inner Sword, their limited numbers made it difficult for them to be high-profile. It was fine to be high-profile once, but if they were high-profile a few times, they would be gone. Weijian Mountain was a sect that showed its wildness to the outside world. They had always been like this, and it was also their protective color. Every sect had its own way of survival. Some were tolerant while others were flamboyant. Those who were tolerant were not necessarily toothless. Those who were flamboyant were not necessarily brainless. It was all for survival. Weijian Mountain's location was not originally called this. It was added by the invaders when the 5 rings were first established. As for what it was called before, who cared about it after tens of thousands of years? This was a barren iron mine mountain. Red mineral soil covered the entire mountain area. The mineral deposits were cheap and had no value to be mined. Even plants could not grow here. In the eyes of Taoists, this was not a place to hold court. However, Wei Jianshan liked this place. They almost pushed their way of cultivation to the extreme. They did not allow any extravagance that would affect their spiritual will to spread in the sect. This was the world of the sword. There was nothing else, including the dilapidated buildings. Not to mention that it did not look like an immortal's home. Even the buildings in the mortal world were better than this. This philosophy made the swordsmen of Weijian Mountain fearless. No one was willing to provoke such a barefoot person. This was their way of survival. However, it was also because of this biased way of life that in the later stages, after a cultivator became a monarch, it was very difficult to climb up. In the words of the Dharma Meridian, there was no immortal chi. There was no Taoist freedom. It was just a ruffian in the cultivation world. The 5 rings was huge and had a large population. There were tens of billions of people. The base of the cultivator population was here. This determined that everyone had their own hobbies. Although the people who entered Weijian Mountain were basically here to suffer, with the base here, Weijian Mountain was still able to survive. There was no lack of suitable foundation establishment cultivators. In the Xianyuan Dome, the foundation establishment cultivators who joined Xianyuan were definitely aiming for the inner sword. If they could not obtain the sword pill, they would settle for the second best and become an outer swordsman. They would have a congenital defect in their temperament, and would need time to make up for it. The foundation establishment cultivators who chose to join Weijian Mountain were different. They were here to be outer swords. They had a clear goal and a firm will. This was probably a very important reason why Xuanyuan's outer swords could not compare to Weijian Mountain's outer swords. Chapter 375. Lu Xiaoyi planned to stay in Weijian Mountain for a period of time. If possible, he hoped to have a few years to learn new things in Weijian Mountain. This was what Yinyi promised him. As the sharpest outer sword sect in the Five Rings, Weijian Mountain had something that Qianshu Peak didn't. He hoped to find this point. At the same time, he could also avoid the endless harassment from the palace halls on Qianshu Peak. Yinyi called out to him. He needed to further rope in this external sword genius. No matter which sect it was, they would invest in their own outstanding disciples regardless of the cost. As long as one of them could slowly walk up, all the investments would be repaid. Xianyuan had already sent back news. They were all cursing, threatening, and greeting him and the people around him. He didn't care. He was already used to it. When Xianyuan took advantage of him, they also cursed him like this. Gudong actually wanted to fight him one-on-one. They had known each other for a few hundred years. How could he not know what that guy was capable of? A loser was nothing to talk about. All of this was within his expectations. There weren't many idiots like Gudong in Qianshu Peak. His plan was a gamble. What if it succeeded? It didn't matter if it didn't succeed. Anyway, this Lu Xiaoyi was officially listed in Weijian Mountain's sword book. It couldn't be erased. Who asked Xianyuan to be so stupid to send his genius disciple over? If he didn't take him, he would be letting the heavens down. He needed to be more careful with this swordsman. Yinyi was very confident. He knew very well what could move a swordsman. Do you plan to travel in Irai? Or return to Qianshu Peak? Yinyi said casually. Lu Xiaoyi replied honestly. It doesn't seem appropriate to travel. The three pure ones are too powerful in Irai. This disciple doesn't want to go there and look for trouble. This disciple wants to stay in Weijian Mountain for a while as long as the sect doesn't summon me. This disciple has admired the swordsmanship of Weijian Mountain for a long time. I want to use this opportunity to fulfill my long-cherished wish. I hope Martial Uncle can grant me my wish. Yinyi nodded with satisfaction. That was a very wise idea. Weijian Mountain would not give him a mission in Irai. Although Lu Xiaoyi was a disciple of Weijian Mountain in name, it was not the same as Xianyuan. He would not be so stupid to squeeze the value out of this disciple now. There were plenty of swordsmen in Weijian Mountain, there was no shortage of people. In Irai, the three pure ones were extraordinarily powerful. No one could guarantee the safety of a disciple if they went out and wandered around. Cultivation was not only about going out to wander around, but also about honing one's sword skills and cultivation in the mountain gate. When the situation was tense, one should stay at home and cultivate hard. When the situation was over, one should go out and wander around. This was the basic rule of every cultivator. But that was not what he wanted to say. The cultivation technique of Weijian Mountain is open to you. Since you are already a disciple of Weijian Mountain, you have the same rights as everyone else. But I still want to advise you to choose carefully. There is a primary and secondary cultivation technique. Do not seek perfection. If you go astray in Weijian Mountain, there will be a lot of people who will find trouble with me. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. Of course he understood that the things of Weijian Mountain could only be a supplement, and not another system. But you might not know that in the inheritance of Weijian Mountain's swordsmanship, there is one thing that Xuanyuan's external sword cannot compare to. That is, the sword case. Yinyi looked proudly at the simple sword case on Lu Xiaoyi's back. His heart was filled with pride. Facing the puzzled gaze of the little swordsman, he explained. There are two types of scabbards for external swords. The first type is the scabbards of your Xianyuan sword sect. The scabbards only focus on nurturing the sword. You carry it on your back every day and immerse your spiritual power in it every day so that you can control it as you wish. This is the most basic function of the scabbards. The other type is the sword case of Weijian Mountain. Our sword case is different from others. It comes from Weijian Mountain's most famous spirit case world. It is filled with all kinds of heavenly materials and earthly treasures. The sword case nurtured in this way is stronger than ordinary sword cases. Most importantly, it has the effect of nurturing the sword's spirit. If a foundation establishment Jin Dan cultivator carries it, the chances of the flying sword having a spirit will increase greatly. If a cultivator with a spirit flying sword carries it, the sword's spirit will automatically be trained in the case. After a long time, the difference will naturally show. If I'm not wrong, your flying sword already has a spirit, right? Lu Xiaoyi did not hide it. Senior's eyes are as sharp as a torch. It indeed has a spirit. Otherwise, Taoist three purities would not be in such a sorry state. Yi chuckled. When you took out your flying sword, I guessed this was the case. Otherwise, no matter how much you cultivate a normal flying sword, it would not be able to reach such a degree of sharpness. In that case, let me ask you again. Since your flying sword already has a spirit, how did you nurture it? Lu Xiaoyi was very honest. Xuanyuan's boa pavilion did not have a similar technique. Therefore, I went to the fan pavilion of the inner sword. There, I obtained a technique to train a sword spirit. From then on, I cultivated it and made great progress. Yini laughed. I knew it. I also went to the boa pavilion. Your Xuanyuan's external swords are all fake. There are tens of thousands of techniques, but how many of them are actually useful? Only 10 or 20% of them are used. The rest are just for show. Truly laughable. Xuanyuan's external swords at the foundation establishment Jin Dan level can't nurture a spirit. The lack of techniques is not the main reason. The lack of a suitable sword case is the main reason. Without a mother, where would an infant come from? Therefore, in the later stages of Jin Dan, my Weijian Mountain swordsmen gradually began to have a sword spirit in their flying swords. However, your Xuanyuan's external swords can forget about it. Once you reach the Yuanying level, almost all of us can nurture a sword spirit in our own flying swords. However, your Xuanyuan's external swords are only a small portion. You still have to rely on luck. This is the main reason for the gap in strength between the two external sword vein. Lu Xiaoyi suddenly understood. He had always wondered why Xuanyuan's external swords, which had such a good cultivation environment, had been suppressed by Weijian Mountain for tens of thousands of years. What was the reason? Was it only because of faith? That did not seem to be entirely correct. Just like Xuanyuan's sword tomb small world, Weijian Mountain also had its own unique item, the space of a spirit box. This was the unique treasure of every sword vein that could survive in this world. It was irreplaceable. In this world, there were many individual cultivators who wanted to rely on their own efforts to cultivate swordsmanship. However, in the end, they achieved nothing. This was because they did not have the most crucial and most basic support. This was not something that could be solved by talent. This unique treasure was not easily shown to others or shared, even among the sword sects that had been close for tens of thousands of years. Xian Yuan would not provide the sword pill to the firmament sword sect for free. Similarly, Weijian Mountain would not give away their sword case. They were already somewhat lacking in using it. Xian Yuan had 20,000 foundation establishment cultivators waiting for them. How could they afford to give it away? Of course, there were always exceptions. For example, a genius disciple of the firmament sword sect wanted to ask for a sword pill from Xian Yuan. For example, the most outstanding external swordsman of the Qianqiu Peak wanted to ask for a sword case from Weijian Mountain. These were all possible. They would not break the balance. Chapter 376. Lu Xiaoyi was very tempted. There was nothing he couldn't accept. He had risked his life in the arena. Not only did he help the Kun Daoli world, he also helped the Weijian Mountain indirectly. He made the three pure ones' plan to return the Aborigines come to an end. At the same time, he made sure that no one from the Weijian Mountain died and no one was injured. Most importantly, he was already listed in the Weijian Mountain disciple list. This was not an undeserved reputation. Weijian Mountain might not need him now, but once their relationship was stable, they would definitely use him when they were in trouble. I provided you with skills and sword case, and you helped me at a certain time. This was the normal interaction in the cultivation world. There was no need to thank each other. Lu Xiaoyi was good at talking. At this time, of course, he could not wait for the other party to beg for a sword case. It was necessary to lower his status appropriately. Even if he was from Xianyuan, even if he had great potential. Martial uncle, I also want to ask for a sword case. Of course, if there is a surplus, and it is not too abrupt. Yi nodded with satisfaction. No matter how talented he was only in foundation establishment. The reason why he wanted to rope this young man in was not only because he had unlimited potential, but also because he knew how to conduct himself. He did not want to feed an ingrate. There will never be a surplus sword case. Just like your Xuanyuan's sword pill will always be in a state of lack. However, the sect has to leave some leeway for itself. If there are outstanding disciples, it should be rewarded. If there are incompetent disciples, it is useless to give them. In this battle, the people of Weijian Mountain are safe and sound. You have contributed greatly. Is the life of the swordsman of Weijian Mountain not worth a sword case? Come with me. Along the way, Yi explained to him. I have never been to Fan Lu. It is not related. So I don't know what method you found to cultivate the sword spirit of the inner sword. But there is one point. The method you found in Fan Lu must be closely related to the sword pill. It is a perfect match. The sword spirit of our outer sword flying sword is ultimately different from the sword pill. This is a fact. Let me guess, you must have brought the sword spirit of your flying sword into your sea of consciousness to train? Lu Xiaoyi sighed in admiration. Martial uncle is brilliant. That is indeed the case. The name of this technique is wave bursting slope. It requires a scene to be constructed in the sea of consciousness for the sword spirit to fight the waves. Yi lightly snorted. That's what I guessed. Because this was the most standard internal sword technique, they had no other tools to use, so they could only do it in the sea of consciousness. But have you ever thought that your flying sword isn't just a sword spirit? The flying sword itself was equally important. If you bring the sword spirit into the sea of consciousness to train every day, but leave the flying sword outside, in a state where the flying sword and the sword spirit are separated for a long time, I'm afraid that this kind of training will get half the result with twice the effort. Your current cultivation base is not high enough, so you might not be able to feel it. When your cultivation base increases and you spend more time with the flying sword, you will be able to feel the separation between the sword spirit and the flying sword. You won't be able to fuse with the flying sword. When that time comes, the flying sword will be destroyed. Lu Shi was moved. He really hadn't thought about this, but he always felt that the sword spirit's enhancement of the power of his flying swords was not satisfactory. He didn't know what was wrong. Now that an experienced Jin Dan like Yi reminded him, he finally understood where the problem was. That's right, the sword spirit can enter the sea of consciousness, but the flying sword can't. But the swordsman's final battle relies on the flying sword, not the sword spirit. In the long run, the sword spirit will become stronger, but the flying sword won't be able to keep up with the sword spirit's pace. Sooner or later, something will happen, Yi sternly said. After all, you haven't been immersed in the Tao of the flying sword for long. After obtaining the sword spirit, the time you spent nurturing the flying sword in the sea of consciousness is even shorter. Everything is still not too late. My Weijian Mountain sword box has this advantage. It nurtures the sword spirit and the flying sword as a whole. It allows these two to improve simultaneously. Of course, they will become more and more harmonious. They will become one, and there won't be any separation. Lu Xiaoyi still had some doubts. Won't this kind of gap get bigger and bigger? When a cultivator reaches Yuanying or even higher, how can Xuanyuan's external swords compare to Weijian Mountain's external swords? Yi shook his head. You're wrong. When a cultivator reaches the realm of Yuanying, they will be able to travel in the void. The strength of their spirit is not something you can imagine. They have other ways to nurture the flying sword. For these, Xuanyuan's methods are not inferior to Weijian Mountain's. But we are strong in the early and middle stages of cultivators, and we can easily maintain this advantage. Therefore, when your Xuanyuan's external swords reach the realm of Grand Cultivator, the starting point is not as good as Weijian Mountain's. To most people, this kind of gap is hard to surpass. Therefore, the starting point is very important, and it's your current stage. Lu Xiaoyi followed Yin Yi and passed through the dilapidated palace buildings of Weijian Mountain. Actually, if one looked carefully, one could see that the dilapidated palace buildings were only on the surface. There were no decorations inside, but the building materials were extremely sturdy. The pillars and walls of the palace were even sturdier than Xuanyuan's. Every palace building was designed as a fortress. For anything, the first consideration was whether it could be preserved in battle. They were really prepared to fight at any time. It was also because they were prepared at any time that the war would not come. Most of the important places of Weijian Mountain were half hidden under the ground, including the Haina Hall where the spiritual box was placed. Lu Xiaoyi did not see this spiritual box. He only stood in the hall and was examined by a few mysterious spiritual senses. They were existences that surpassed Jin Dan. He could not determine how high they were, but he thought that the power protecting it in Weijian Mountain was similar to how Xian Yuan protected the small world of the Sword Tomb, right? Yin Yi communicated with a few words and indicated to Lu Xiaoyi to wait. It was obvious that the communication was very smooth. Xian Yuan was born and had just entered Weijian Mountain. He had great potential. These conditions made the grand cultivators not refuse to open a back door for him. For tens of thousands of years, the three major powers of the sword vein had worked together to nurture their disciples with great potential. When one sect sent out an evildoer, the other two would do their best to help. They were all looking forward to the miracle that happened tens of thousands of years ago. After a while, 3 sword boxes floated down from the dome of the hall. These were directly taken out from the spiritual box by the grand cultivators in the hall. Yin Yi reminded him at the side. In Weijian Mountain, normally every disciple has 3 sword boxes to choose from. Those who have contributed to the sect will be given 2 chances to choose from 6 sword boxes. The most outstanding and those who have contributed greatly will have 3 chances to choose from 9 sword boxes. You've made a great contribution in this battle, so the sect will give you 3 chances. You have to be careful and choose the one that is most compatible with you. This is the principle. The sword boxes that appear later will not be of higher quality. They are just randomly taken. There is no order. Lu Xiaoyi bowed and thanked Weijian Mountain for their kindness. Then, he placed his attention on the 3 sword boxes in front of him. In terms of color and appearance, there was not much difference, but there was something special about each of them. Chapter 377. Out of the 3 sword sheaths, one was fire-shaped as if there was a fire essence in it, one was wood-shaped as if it was full of life, and the last one was mysterious and unpredictable. These 3 sword sheaths were standard 80% to 90% solid, the remaining 10% to 20% still required the cultivator to perfect and refine according to their own characteristics. This was also the specialty of Weijian Mountain. They placed a lot of importance on sword sheaths, unlike Xuanyuan's sword sheaths, which were mass-produced goods. But this could not be blamed on Xuanyuan's lack of external swords. They did not have similar spirit sheaths and were helpless. Lu Xiaoyi's luck was not bad, because out of the 3 sword sheaths, there was a very rare spatial sword sheath. It could greatly increase the dark space ability of the flying sword. If the swordsman had a spatial assassination sword, this would be a match made in heaven. Lu Xiaoyi did indeed have a shadow attack sword that had nurtured a sword spirit. However, hidden fragrance didn't walk the path of space, but rather the more ordinary path of breath concealment. How should he choose? The sword of leaping attack was very high-end, it could greatly increase one's battle power. He also had the ability to refine another flying sword that was related to space. Whether it was in Weijian Mountain or in the Dome, it was not a difficult thing. He chose to give up. Because he was not focused on the shadow attack sword, he was focused on the first sword. The aspect that strengthened him the most was the principle that he had followed for the past 30 years. This principle had brought him brilliant battle results. What reason did he have to change it? As for the fire form and the wood form, he didn't consider them at all. Before he reached the peak of the power of the flying sword in the foundation establishment stage, he wouldn't consider the problem of the 5 elements. Considering these problems in the foundation establishment stage would only yield half the results with twice the effort, and the gains wouldn't make up for the losses. That was something to worry about after he reached the Jinden stage. The 3 sword sheaths disappeared mysteriously. No one said anything about his choice. He walked his own path. If he walked the wrong path, he could not blame anyone, including Yin Yi, who felt that it was a pity. In his opinion, this spatial sword sheath was very good. It was a sword sheath that had a very low chance of appearing. Unfortunately, this kid did not know what was good for him. Another 3 sword sheaths descended from the dome of the main hall. One of them was a water-type sword sheath with a supple nature, another one was a wind-type sword sheath with a speed nature, and then another one was a fire-type sword sheath. It seemed to be the one from the first batch. Therefore, Lu Xiaoyi understood that this was really a random draw. The sword sheath that was drawn the first time was very likely to appear in the second draw. This also proved that there were actually not many sword sheaths that were completely formed in the space of the spirit case. The Aqua Soft repair was very practical. It could repair the damage that the flying sword received in battle at the fastest speed. This included physical damage, as well as soft damage such as spirit invasion. It was very practical, but his flying sword had a sword spirit, so he did not need it urgently. There was no need to mention the wind-shaped speed. Speed was the foundation of a flying sword, and there was no sword cultivator who did not like fast flying swords. However, Lu Xiaoyi had his own methods in this regard. For example, the continuous engraving of the speed sword formation of the 4 seasons was somewhat repetitive. He was somewhat unwilling to use such a rare opportunity on repetitive options. The fire-shaped sword box was completely ignored. Seeing him give up again, Yi sighed again. He suspected that this fellow didn't understand the meaning of his words just now. The wind-type sword sheath was a very good choice, and it was also very rare. If it really didn't work out, the water-type sword sheath was also very practical, and it was very important for the maintenance of the flying sword. Today's draw at Haina Hall was very lucky. There were 3 sword sheaths that were very hard to come by, but this brat did not choose any of them. Did he really want to hold back? How was that possible? He had been in Wei Sword Mountain for hundreds of years, and had seen all kinds of strange sword sheaths appearing, but he had never seen anything that was better than these 3 sword sheaths. Opportunities would not favor you forever, and if you missed it, it would not come again. Yin Ye's thoughts were confirmed when the 3 sword sheaths appeared for the 3rd time. The first one was a fire-type sword sheath. The second one was also a fire-type sword sheath. This was not strange at all, because the nature of the spirit sheath space leaned towards the fire attribute of the 5 elements, so there were many fire-type sword sheaths. Not to mention 2 appearing at once, even 3 fire-type sword sheaths appearing at once was very common. The third one was a normal strength sword sheath, second only to the fire-type sword sheath, and this one was even more of a half-finished product. Because it was different from the other 8 sword sheaths that were 80 to 90% solid, it was only 50% solid, and it was more like a half-finished product. It still needed the cultivator to complete the other 50%. With the ability of a foundation establishment cultivator, this kind of replenishment was very difficult. The key was, if you replenished too many things, would it affect the effectiveness of the sword sheath itself? The choice failed. At least that was how Yin Yi saw it. Lu Xiaoyi had a different view from him. To be honest, he was taking a big risk, and he did not think that others would give him face to choose a fourth time. Others had rules, but he had his pride, and this was the last time. He felt that he was a lucky person. Sure enough, in the last three choices, a sword sheath that made his eyes light up appeared, and it was the half-finished strength sword sheath. He liked strength, and he thought that a mere foundation establishment cultivator should just honestly study strength. What was the use of making something so grand? What if they could not understand it? It was not that being grand was bad, but at the current stage, they simply could not understand it thoroughly. They could only see the big picture, and obtain some vague superficial knowledge. Rather than this, it was better to practice simple strength to the extreme. He did not expect that the strength sword sheath, which was usually very common, would appear so rarely this time. Instead, there were some grand quality sword sheaths, and this made his test even more intense. Fortunately, he persevered with his heart, and luck finally returned to him. This sword sheath, the nature of strength was secondary. What he valued the most was actually its 50% solid form. 50% solid form meant that the other 50% needed to be replenished by himself. In his philosophy, what was the most suitable for him? None of the sword sheaths in the spirit sheath space were suitable. Only the things he made himself were the things that truly suited him the most. He had the sword spirits to help him, and in this 50% replenishment, he could perfectly fulfill the requirements of the sword spirits, and this was the best choice for him. Before seeing this sword sheath, he was not sure what he wanted, because he did not know that the so-called solid form was not all 80 or 90%. There was actually a 50% solid form, so when he saw this sword sheath, he immediately knew that this was what he wanted. Without hesitation, he took off the sword sheath, and bowed towards the empty space again. This was to thank the old senior who took the sword sheath for him. The senior might not need it, but he could not do it. The choice had been made, and the next thing was his business, whether to destroy the sword sheath, or to complete his plan. This required careful planning, and he actually did not have much confidence. Chapter 378. You want to refine your own box? Do you know the difficulty of doing so? Yin was experienced and had sharp eyes. He quickly saw something from Lu Xiaoyi's choice. This was a very bold idea and also very crazy. Of course, it was very swordsman. Refining a box was very difficult. It wasn't difficult because of the preciousness of the materials, the level of the magic power, whether one could control the mind, whether one had profound knowledge of refining. These were not the reason. The biggest reason was that the sword box produced from the spirit box space was not the inanimate sword box from Xianyuan. The reason why it was precious and rare was because it had spirituality. Because it had spirituality, it was very possible for the cultivator to lose this spirituality due to improper handling during the process of refining their own things. The possibility of this was not small. Even the normal 80% or 90% solid sword box was often destroyed by people, not to mention this 50% solid sword box. After all, in the foundation establishment realm, there was very little knowledge about the abstract fields of spirit, mystery, inexplicability, and spirituality. It was impossible for them to reach the level of a major cultivator. When half of a spirituality sword box required the cultivator to refine their own things, failure was almost unavoidable. I have a sword spirit. It can help me, Lu Xiaoyi explained softly. Yin was startled and immediately realized that this was indeed an effective way. Using a sword spirit with innate spirituality to help refine the sword box, it should be able to preserve the spirituality of the sword box to the greatest extent, right? He realized that his brain wasn't working well. He couldn't understand the young man. If this was indeed a way, then the sword box and the cultivator could achieve the most perfect fit. But the problem was, who could create a sword spirit in the foundation establishment realm? Once a flying sword had a life, it would give birth to countless possibilities. However, these possibilities couldn't be easily replicated. They were unique. Want to learn? You have to create a sword spirit first. Alright, you can use my sword talisman to get what you need from the warehouse outside Weijian Mountain. However, it's only limited to this one time. This was the only way Yin Yi could help him. Lu Xiaoyi was very surprised. Martial uncle, Weijian Mountain still has a warehouse? Yin Yi scolded with a smile. You look down on us just because our place is shabby? Let me tell you, not only is there an outer treasury, there is also an inner treasury. Let's see if you have the ability to enter. Also, I want to warn you, use it sparingly. Don't use up the rest of my life's quota. At that time, all of us will have to go out and beg for food. Lu Xiaoyi agreed with a smile. He was starting to like the big family of Sword Vein. Although the people he met were always strange, they spared no effort in helping their disciples. Lu Xiaoyi was not stupid, but he never said words of gratitude because he always felt that words like, thank you, or sorry, were the palest words in the human world. There was no need to say anything. Just wait for an opportunity. Now that he had returned to the dead Fei Chai's cave, it was like he was a dove occupying a sparrow's nest. He needed to be careful with the refinement of the sword sheath. Confidence was one thing, meticulousness was another. All of you, go in. Go take a look at your new home. Think about what needs to be changed. How? Lu Xiaoyi chased the three unwilling sword spirits inside. They knew that their father was up to something again. There are a few things you need to take note of. In the future, you might have more brothers and sisters, so don't be stifled. If you feel that you are lacking in any aspect, tell us and we will think of a solution. There is still half of the space. What materials are needed, what goals are achieved, everyone has to speak up. There was one good thing about sword spirits. No matter if they were willing or not, they would not lie. In the next few months, no one came to disturb him. This was a little inconceivable because as a famous person in the Weijian Mountain Foundation establishment circle, there were many who wanted to drink and compete with him. However, these were all stopped by Yin Yi, including Xuanyuan's letter urging him to return. Yin Ye's words were very shameless. This person was reluctant to part with his woman, and was too happy to think about home. His goal was very simple. He wanted to help this kid refine his own sword case, and completely establish a relationship with Weijian Mountain. In this way, half of this disciple with great potential would belong to Weijian Mountain. This was a good deal. A few months later, Lu Xiaoyi, who had been concentrating on studying the sword case, had a rough idea of what to do. The materials were all ready. The foundation of a sect was not something that an individual could understand. The embryonic form of the sword case was gradually reached after months of arguments between him and the three sword spirits. There was a definite plan that was acceptable to all parties. There was no need to waste any more time. Some things could not be foolproof the longer one thought about it. There was always a limit. On the contrary, if one was too careful, they would be overcautious. Cultivation was a gamble, including all aspects of cultivation. On this day, Lu Xiaoyi adjusted himself to his best condition, and also restored the three sword spirits to their peak condition. They would go all out today, and if they did not succeed, or if they did not destroy the sword sheath, they would not stop. The first step of refining was to carry the sword case on their backs. Lu Xiaoyi did not forget to threaten them. Work hard. Be careful. If any of you burn my boat while refining, you can wait to swim in the surf for the rest of your life. You are not allowed to take half a step onto the shore. The three sword spirits responded in unison. Their momentum was very strong. Lu Xiaoyi cheered everyone on first. Then, he slowly injected his magic power into the sword case. He had done this countless of times in the past few months. He was very familiar with it. In an instant, he felt that he had complete control over the sword case. Thus, he threw a few materials into the sword case. His magic power melted and turned into different liquids, making it easier to construct. The 3 sword spirits were already prepared. Each of them pushed the materials that belonged to their task and set up the foundation in the sword case. They were all spiritual beings. Of course, they knew what they could touch and what they could not touch in the sword case. Just like the original sword case was in embryonic form, the 3 of them were hardworking masters. With the materials provided by the old master, they provided an endless supply of magic power and spiritual support to give the embryonic form a new function. It was a composition that had been discussed countless times. There was nothing to hesitate or argue about. For things like refining the sword case, it was best to do it in one go. The most taboo was to hesitate and change halfway. The sword case gradually took shape under the combined efforts of 1 person and 3 spirits. It showed its embryonic form according to the plan. Everything went smoothly. This was to be expected. The months of preparation were not in vain. It was the result of Lu Xiaoyi's repeated weighing and considering the possible difficulties to the extreme. Very quickly, the sword case's solidification reached the threshold of 90%. Now, it was completely clear what his goal was. This was an enlarged version of the real Bo Lang slope. But now, this Bo Lang slope was bigger and had more steps. It could accommodate more flying swords at the same time. It had also increased the level from 13 steps to 99 steps. Countless rare materials were needed for this. But Lu Xiaoyi was a child selling his father's land. He did not feel any heartache. To a sect, what was the consumption of a cultivator? But he forgot that this might not be much to Wei Jianshan, but it was a big deal to Yin Yi. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.